Beneath the silent pines, where the wind moves like a quiet sigh through the needles and the earth holds its secrets close, families lived with a gentleness that no shadow could fully take away. In the villages tucked between the tall trees and the slow rivers of that land, the days unfolded with a soft rhythm. Snow melted into thin streams that ran like silver threads between the roots. The air grew warmer, carrying the faint scent of pine resin and damp soil waking from its long rest. People rose early to tend their small gardens, their hands moving with care over the dark earth, planting seeds they hoped would one day grow into something steady and good. Children played near the doorsteps, their laughter low and careful, as if they understood that some sounds were better kept soft. Old ones sat by the hearth when evening came, their faces lined with years of quiet watching, their voices low as they spoke of things that mattered most. A mother in one such home moved through her day with steady hands. She mended clothes by the window where the light fell gently, her needle pulling thread through worn fabric with the same patience she used to soothe a frightened child. Sometimes, when the house was still, she would take a folded paper from a hidden place beneath the floorboards. It was a letter, creased from many readings, the words inside written in a hand that had once been strong and sure. She would trace the lines with her fingertip, not needing to read them again because she already carried every word in her heart. The letter spoke of love and of waiting, of small hopes that refused to fade even when the world felt heavy. She would fold it carefully again, tuck it away, and return to her work, her face calm but her eyes holding a light that came from somewhere deep and private. Her husband had gone away some time before, following a path that led into the deeper woods and beyond. She did not speak much of where he had gone or why, but the neighbors understood without words. In the evenings she would sit with her children and tell them stories, not of grand things, but of the land itself, of how the pines had stood for longer than anyone could remember, and how the people who lived among them had learned to bend without breaking. She would hum an old song under her breath while she stirred a simple pot of soup, the melody carrying memories of gatherings before the weight had settled so firmly on every shoulder. When fear came, as it sometimes did in the quiet hours, she would hold her youngest close and whisper that courage was not always loud. Sometimes it was simply the act of waking each morning and choosing to keep the hearth warm and the hearts inside it tended with kindness. Nearby, an older couple lived in a small house with walls that had seen many seasons. The man would walk slowly to the edge of the trees each day, his steps careful on the soft ground. He carried a small bundle, perhaps a bit of bread wrapped in cloth, or a message passed from one hand to another in the market square. He would leave it in a place known only to those who needed to find it, then return home as if he had only gone to gather firewood. His wife waited by the window, her knitting in her lap, the needles clicking softly like a gentle clock marking time that belonged to them alone. When he returned, they would sit together without speaking much, their hands finding each other in the space between their chairs. In that touch was a whole conversation. I am here, we are still together, the small flame we guard has not gone out. The children of the village learned early how to move through the world with quiet eyes. A boy might slip away after chores to carry a basket to an elderly neighbor whose son had not come home. He would leave the basket by the door and hurry back before anyone could ask too many questions. A girl might sit with her grandmother and learn the old songs, singing them softly so the words stayed inside the walls where they could do no harm and yet keep something alive. These were not large gestures, but they were the threads that held the fabric of each day together. When soldiers passed along the road, the village grew still. Doors closed gently, voices dropped to whispers, and eyes turned inward. Yet even in that stillness, a hand might reach out to steady a trembling shoulder, or a piece of bread might be shared under the table when no one else could see. In the evenings the pines seemed to draw closer, their branches forming a sheltering roof over the scattered homes. Families gathered near the fire, the light flickering across faces that had grown used to holding both sorrow and stubborn hope at the same time. Someone might read aloud from a worn book, the words chosen carefully so they spoke of resilience without naming the things that could bring trouble. Another might mend a torn coat by the glow, the stitches small and even, as if each one was a quiet promise that things could be made whole again. When the fire burned low, they would sit in the soft dark and listen to the wind in the trees. It sounded sometimes like voices from far away, carrying news that could not be spoken openly but could be felt in the heart. A rumor might travel from one home to another like a leaf on the stream, nothing spoken plainly, yet everyone understood that something was stirring beyond the familiar paths, something that asked them to keep believing in the possibility of a different morning. There was a young woman who lived at the edge of the village, closer to the forest. She would rise before dawn and walk among the pines, her steps light on the needle-covered ground. She carried messages sometimes, folded small and hidden in her sleeve or in the lining of her coat. The fear was always there, a cold thread running beneath her ribs, but she moved with a grace born of knowing the woods as well as she knew her own hands. When she returned, she would sit with her family and share what little news she could, her voice low and steady. Her mother would pour her a cup of weak tea, and they would sit together in silence that felt like strength. In those moments, the simple act of being present for one another became its own kind of courage. The young woman would think of the letter her own brother had sent months earlier, the one that spoke of missing the sound of the wind through these same pines. She kept that letter pressed inside a book, and sometimes at night she would open the pages just to feel the paper against her fingers, a small connection across the distance that no one could take from her. The land itself seemed to hold the people in its quiet way. The pines did not judge or ask for explanations. They simply stood, year after year, their roots deep in soil that had known both peace and hardship. Families learned from them. They learned to endure without hardening, to keep small kindnesses alive even when larger hopes felt far away. A neighbor might bring a handful of herbs for a sick child. Someone else might offer to watch the little ones while a mother went to the forest for a few hours of necessary work. These exchanges happened without fanfare, yet they wove a net of care that held the village together when the world outside pressed close. As spring deepened and the days grew longer, a new feeling began to move through the air. It was not spoken of directly. It lived in the way people looked at one another a moment longer, and the way hands lingered when passing a tool or a piece of bread. It lived in the dreams that came more often now, dreams of walking freely again, of hearing laughter without the need to hush it, of letters that could be read openly by the window instead of hidden beneath the floor. The pines stood watch over all of it, their branches moving in the same slow rhythm they had kept for generations. Beneath them, the families continued their gentle work of preserving what mattered most, the ability to feel, to hope, to show kindness even when fear walked the roads. And in the spirit of these families preserving quiet dignity and hidden hopes beneath the pines, perhaps you might find comfort in a carefully chosen piece of World War II memorabilia or the moving film Midway on Amazon Prime, which honors the personal courage found in every theater of that great conflict. It is a gentle way to hold close the stories of ordinary people who endured extraordinary times. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The wind continued to move through the needles, carrying the scent of earth and pine and the faint promise of seasons still to come. In the villages, lamps were extinguished one by one, and people lay down to rest with their small hopes tucked safely beside them. The land breathed slowly in the dark, and the families who lived there breathed with it, their hearts steady in the knowledge that even the quietest endurance can become the root of something stronger when the time is right. The pines kept their vigil, and beneath their shelter the stories of ordinary courage continued to unfold, one gentle day at a time, like letters written in the soft language of the heart. In the soft glow of a candle flame that barely pushed back the darkness, a soldier traced the worn edges of a photograph that held everything he loved most in the world. The night had settled gently over the long lines where the men waited. Outside the simple shelter of earth and timber, the wind moved through the trees with a low, steady sound, like someone breathing in their sleep. Inside, the candle stood on a makeshift shelf made from a crate, its light falling in a small circle that touched the faces of those gathered close. The flame flickered when the wind found a crack in the wall, sending soft shadows across the photograph in the soldier's hands. He held it carefully, as if the paper itself might grow tired from too much looking. The faces in the picture were small and familiar, a woman with kind eyes and a child whose smile seemed to reach across the distance that separated them. He had carried this photograph for so long that the corners had softened and the surface had taken on the warmth of his pocket. Sometimes he would press it to his cheek before sleep, just to feel something that belonged to the life he had left behind. Beside him sat another man, older, with lines around his eyes that spoke of many such nights. They did not speak loudly. Their voices stayed low, almost like the wind outside, as if the quiet itself was something they needed to protect. The older man had his own photograph, tucked inside a small tin that he opened only when the candle was lit and the others had grown still. In his picture was a street lined with trees, the kind that turned golden in autumn, and a house with a garden where flowers had once grown in neat rows. He would look at it for a long time without saying anything, then close the tin gently and slip it back into his coat. When he did speak, it was often about small things, the way the light used to fall through the kitchen window in the morning, or how the bread tasted when it was still warm from the oven. These were not grand stories. They were the kind of memories that could be held in the hand like the photograph itself, small enough to carry through the long days and the longer nights. The younger soldier listened. He did not interrupt. He simply held his own picture a little closer and let the words settle around them like the candlelight. In the quiet that followed, he thought of his own home, of the last morning he had seen his wife and child. He remembered the way she had stood in the doorway, one hand raised in a wave that was both greeting and goodbye. He had wanted to say something more, something that would fit inside the space between one breath and the next, but the words had stayed inside him. Now he carried them with the photograph, turning them over in his mind when the night grew too still. Sometimes he would write them down in a letter, the pencil moving slowly across the paper by the same candle that now lit the photograph. He would fold the letter carefully, write the address he knew by heart, and then tuck it away until he could send it. The writing itself became a kind of comfort, as if putting the words on paper made the distance feel a little less wide. Across the small space, another man sat with his back against the earthen wall. He had no photograph that anyone could see, but he carried a letter instead, folded many times until it was soft as cloth. He would take it out when the others were resting and read it by the candle's edge, his lips moving silently over the familiar lines. The letter was from his sister, written in a hand that had grown shakier with each passing month. She wrote of the garden they had tended together as children, of the way the vegetables still grew even when the world felt uncertain. She asked him to be careful, to remember the small things that made life good. He would fold the letter again and press it to his chest for a moment before returning it to its safe place. In that gesture was a quiet promise. He would carry her words with him, just as the others carried their photographs, and he would try to live in a way that honored what she had written. The candle flame danced when someone shifted or when a breath moved across it. In its light, faces looked softer, younger, as if the years of separation had been gently set aside for a little while. One man pulled a small piece of bread from his pocket and broke it without a word, offering half to the soldier beside him. It was not much, but the sharing happened without ceremony, the way one might pass a cup of water to a thirsty friend. The younger soldier took it with a nod that said more than words could. He ate slowly, tasting not just the bread but the kindness that had offered it. In return, he reached into his own pack and brought out a stub of pencil he had been saving. He placed it on the crate between them, a small offering in the shared light. These exchanges were never spoken of later. They simply became part of the evening, like the candle itself, something that helped the darkness feel less complete. Outside, the land stretched away in darkness. The trees stood tall and still, their branches moving only when the wind asked them to. The men inside the shelter knew the land was there, vast and quiet, holding its own secrets. Sometimes they would hear the distant sound of movement, but it stayed far away, like a story being told in another room. Inside, they stayed with what was close: the photograph, the letter, the low voices sharing memories of streets and gardens and faces that waited somewhere beyond the lines. The younger soldier thought again of his child, wondering if the little one still reached for the door when footsteps sounded outside, hoping it might be him. The thought brought a private ache, but it also brought a kind of strength. He would look at the photograph once more, tracing the curve of the child's smile with his thumb, and feel the ache settle into something quieter, something he could carry without it breaking him. The older man spoke again, his voice even softer now. He told of a winter morning long ago when snow had covered the garden and the trees had stood white against a pale sky. He described how his mother had made soup that smelled of herbs and warmth, and how the family had sat together at the table, their hands wrapped around bowls that steamed in the cold air. As he spoke, the others listened without moving much, their eyes on the candle or on their own hands. The story was not about the past as something lost. It was about the past as something still alive inside them, something the photograph and the letter helped keep breathing. When he finished, no one said anything for a while. The silence felt full rather than empty, as if the memory had been passed around like the piece of bread and had made each of them a little warmer. In another corner, a man who had been writing stopped and looked at what he had written. The letter was for his parents, though he knew it might take a long time to reach them. He had described the way the light fell through the trees in the late afternoon, the way it reminded him of the orchard behind their house. He had not written about the weight he carried or the fears that came in the quiet hours. Those stayed inside, folded away like the photograph he kept in his breast pocket. Instead, he wrote of small hopes, that the apples would be sweet this year, that the roof would hold through another winter, that they would all sit together again when the time came. He folded the paper carefully, wrote the address, and slipped it into the same pocket that held the photograph. Both paper and picture rested against his heart, two anchors in the long night. The candle burned lower as the hours passed. Its light grew softer, the circle of warmth smaller. One by one the men settled into what rest they could find, some lying on rough blankets, others sitting with their backs to the wall. The younger soldier kept the photograph in his hand a little longer, the flame's reflection moving across the faces in the picture. He thought of his wife's last words to him, simple and steady: "Come back when you can, and know that we are here." He had carried those words with the photograph ever since. Now, in the hush of the shelter, they felt like a small light of their own, something that no darkness could entirely cover. He placed the photograph carefully beside him, within reach if the night grew too long, and closed his eyes. Sleep came slowly, but when it came it carried him toward the faces he loved, toward streets and gardens that existed now only in memory and in the quiet stories shared by candlelight. Just as these soldiers carried their private fears and tender memories close to their hearts, our Gumroad collection offers a rare digital treasury of uncensored wartime photographs and raw personal accounts from the Eastern Front, material too stark and real for open platforms. It lets you witness the unvarnished human side that history often softens. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The candle eventually guttered and went out, leaving the shelter in a darkness that felt almost gentle after the long evening. Outside, the wind continued its slow passage through the trees, and the land held its quiet watch. The men slept or lay awake with their thoughts, each carrying what he could not leave behind: a photograph with softened edges, a letter folded many times, the memory of a voice or a smile or a garden in autumn light. These small things became their quiet strength, the anchors that kept them from drifting too far from who they had been before the lines stretched so long and the nights grew so deep. In the morning they would rise again, the photograph or the letter returned to its safe place, and they would move through another day with the same steady care they had shown in the candle's glow. The trees stood around them, tall and patient, and the soldiers, in their own patient way, kept the small flames of memory and kindness alive inside their hearts, one evening at a time, one gentle sharing at a time, Beneath the vast and listening sky. In the hush of a small room lit only by a single lamp turned low, hands moved with careful patience over a sheet of paper that carried more than anyone could see at first glance. The night outside pressed close against the walls. Trees stood dark and still beyond the village edge, their branches forming a quiet canopy over the paths that wound between houses and into the deeper woods. Inside, the light from the lamp fell softly on a table where a young man sat bent over his work. He wrote slowly, each letter shaped with deliberate care so that the words looked like any other message that might pass from one place to another on an ordinary evening. To anyone who glanced at the paper, it might seem like a simple note about the weather or a request for supplies. Yet every word had been chosen with another meaning hidden inside, like a seed tucked beneath ordinary soil. The young man's heart beat steadily but with a quiet intensity that came from knowing how much depended on the message reaching the right hands without drawing notice. He folded the paper once, then again, until it was small enough to fit inside a coat pocket or the lining of a basket. When he finished, he sat for a moment with his eyes closed, letting the weight of what he carried settle into something he could manage. Nearby, in a clearing where the trees opened just enough for a sliver of moonlight to reach the ground, another person waited. She was older, with hands that had known years of work in gardens and kitchens. A basket rested at her feet, covered with a cloth that looked no different from any other cloth used to carry bread or vegetables to market. Inside, beneath the bread, lay the folded paper the young man had prepared. She would carry it along the familiar path that led toward the next village, stopping to speak with neighbors along the way in the easy manner of someone simply going about her day. Her voice would stay light when she greeted those she passed. She might mention the state of the roads or ask after a sick child, all the while knowing that the real message traveled safely beneath the ordinary words. The fear was always present, a small cold thread beneath her ribs, but she had learned to walk with it the way one learns to walk with a familiar ache. It did not stop her steps. It simply traveled alongside them. When she reached the place where the message needed to be left, she would set the basket down for a moment as if resting. In that brief pause, the paper would change hands or find its hidden spot, passed with a glance or a touch that said everything without sound. Then she would continue on, the basket lighter now, her face showing nothing more than the calm of someone returning home after a long walk. The relief came later, in the quiet of her own small room, when she could sit by the window and let her shoulders ease. She would think of the faces of those she loved, of the children who played in the yards and the elders who told stories by the fire, and she would feel the same steady determination that had carried her through the path. This work was not loud. It asked for no recognition. It simply needed to be done with the same care one might use to mend a torn sleeve or tend a young plant so it could grow strong. Back in the dimly lit room, the young man had begun another task. He sat before a small radio set, the kind that could be carried and hidden when necessary. His fingers moved over the controls with practiced gentleness, sending signals that sounded like routine reports to any ear that might overhear. Yet each pause, each change in rhythm, carried meaning for those who knew how to listen. He worked in the soft glow of the lamp, his face close to the equipment so that the light would not spill too far. When he finished a transmission, he would sit back and breathe deeply, the air in the room cool against his skin. The responsibility sat heavy on him some nights, like a coat that had grown too warm. One mistake, one signal sent in the wrong way, and the careful web they were weaving could begin to unravel. He carried that knowledge not as a burden that crushed him, but as a quiet reminder to move slowly and with intention. In the moments between transmissions, he would sometimes take out a small photograph of his own family, the edges softened from being carried in his pocket. He would look at it for a short while, letting the familiar faces steady him before returning to the work. The woman with the basket and the young man with the careful signals never met in person on most nights. Their connection lived in the messages that passed between them, in the trust that each would do their part with the same quiet precision. Yet they shared something deeper than names or faces. They shared the knowledge that their ordinary-looking actions were helping to protect something larger, the hopes of people waiting in villages and forests, the possibility of a morning when the weight that pressed on every heart might begin to lift. This knowledge gave their work a kind of gentle strength. It did not make the fear disappear, but it gave the fear a purpose. When the young man finished for the night, he would turn the lamp even lower and sit for a while in the near dark, listening to the wind outside. He might write a few lines in a letter to his sister, words that spoke of missing the sound of her laughter and hoping the garden was doing well this season. He would not mention the lamplit room or the signals sent in the quiet. Those stayed folded inside him, like the paper messages he prepared. The letter itself became another small act of care, a way of keeping the thread of ordinary life alive even while he moved through the hidden patterns of his nights. In the forest clearing, the woman sometimes paused on her return path to help someone she met along the way. An older neighbor might be struggling with a bundle of firewood, and she would stop to share the load for a short distance, speaking of simple things like the ripening of berries or the way the light lingered longer now that spring was deepening. These moments of kindness were not planned. They rose naturally from the same patience that guided her careful steps with the hidden message. Helping another person carry a burden, even a small one, reminded her that the larger work she did was also a form of carrying. It kept her heart from growing too heavy with the secrecy. When she reached her own doorway, she would set the empty basket inside and light a small lamp of her own. In its glow she would sit with her hands resting in her lap, letting the day settle. Sometimes she thought of the young man she had never met, imagining him in his quiet room, and she would send a silent wish for his safety across the distance that separated them. The wish was wordless, but it carried the same steady care she put into every step she took. The work continued across many such nights. In other rooms and other clearings, others moved with the same deliberate gentleness. A man might carry a message inside the lining of his coat while he repaired a fence in plain view of anyone passing. A woman might hum an old song while she hung laundry, the rhythm of her voice hiding the timing of a signal meant for ears that listened from afar. These were not grand gestures. They were the small, repeated actions of people who understood that hope could be protected through patience and attention to detail. The private fears remained, the sudden sound of footsteps on a path, the moment when a message took longer than expected to reach its destination, the knowledge that the safety of many rested on the accuracy of one quiet transmission. Yet alongside the fear lived a quiet resilience. It showed itself in the way they returned to their tasks night after night, and the way they found small comforts in a shared glance or a piece of bread passed without words, and the way they carried thoughts of home like talismans through the darkness. One evening, after a long transmission, the young man in the dimly lit room received a message in return. It came through the same careful signals, a short confirmation that the information had arrived safely. He sat back from the radio and allowed himself a small smile in the low light. The relief was quiet, like the settling of dust after a breeze. He thought of all the hands that had moved the message along its path, the woman with the basket, the neighbor who had passed it further, the others whose names he would never know. Each had done their part with the same steady care. In that moment he felt connected to them, not through faces or voices, but through the invisible thread of trust they had woven together. He turned the lamp down completely and sat in the darkness for a while, letting his eyes adjust to the night. Outside, the trees stood guard, their presence a reminder that the land itself had seen many such careful efforts across the years. The wind moved through the branches with its usual low sound, carrying nothing that needed to be hidden and yet holding space for all that did. The woman with the basket, on her own path home that same night, paused at the edge of the village to help a child who had dropped a small bundle. She knelt to gather the scattered items, speaking softly to the child so the tears would stop. When the child was calm again, she walked with him the rest of the way to his door, the basket swinging lightly at her side. The ordinary kindness of the moment felt like part of the larger pattern she carried inside her. It reminded her that even in the midst of careful, hidden work, the heart could still choose gentleness. Later, in her room, she sat by her own small light and thought of the message that had passed safely through her hands. She did not know exactly where it had gone or what larger shape it helped form. She only knew that she had done her part with the same attention she gave to tending her garden or mending a tear in a favorite shawl. That knowledge brought its own kind of peace, quiet and deep, like the peace that comes after a long walk when the feet finally rest. The careful, unseen work of those who wove the web of hope reminds us how much quiet dedication goes into preserving truth. If this story has moved you, a small tip on Ko-Fi, even a single dollar, helps sustain the countless hours of research and care that go into bringing these forgotten human moments back to light for everyone who needs them. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the days that followed, the young man and the woman with the basket continued their nights of quiet movement. The lamp stayed low in the small room. The basket traveled its familiar paths beneath cloths that looked like any other. Messages passed from hand to hand, from voice to voice, in ways that drew no special attention yet carried the weight of many hopes. The private fears did not vanish, but they were met each time with the same steady patience. A shared piece of bread, a gentle word spoken in passing, a moment of stillness after a message was safely delivered, these small acts became the quiet heroism that sustained the larger effort. The trees continued to stand watch over the clearings and the villages. The wind moved through them with its unchanging rhythm. And beneath that rhythm, in rooms lit by single lamps and on paths walked with ordinary baskets, people carried the hidden code of their care, one careful step, one folded paper, one steady heartbeat at a time. The hopes they protected grew a little stronger with each night that passed, rooted in the same soil that held the trees and warmed by the same gentle light that fell on hands doing their quiet work. Through the mist that rose from the dark waters like a soft breath, footsteps moved with the quiet certainty of those who knew every hidden path by heart. The swamps lay deep and still beneath the trees, their surface broken only by the slow ripple of water and the occasional call of a night bird. Roots twisted above the mud like ancient hands reaching for air, and the ground gave way in places where the unwary might sink. Yet for those who had grown up on the edges of these waters, the land offered its own kind of shelter. The mist hid movement. The thick trees muffled sound. The difficult ground kept strangers from following too closely. In this place, a small group moved like shadows given form, their steps careful and sure even when the mud pulled at their boots and the water soaked through to their skin. A young woman led the way, her feet finding the firmer ridges without needing to look down. She had walked these paths since she was small, following her father when he hunted or gathered wood. Now she carried something more than a basket. Tucked close to her body was a message folded small, the paper protected from the damp by a layer of cloth. Behind her walked an older man whose hair had turned the color of winter mist. He moved more slowly but with the same steady knowledge of the land. His breath came in low, even rhythms, and when the mud grew especially thick he would reach out a hand to steady the younger one beside him, a boy whose eyes were wide but whose steps never faltered for long. They did not speak much. Words traveled poorly in the open air, and the swamp itself seemed to prefer silence. Instead they moved in a rhythm born of trust and long practice, each footfall placed where the ground would hold. The young woman thought of her home as she walked. It was not far from the edge of the swamp, a small house with a garden that had once grown vegetables in neat rows. She remembered the way the light fell through the window in the morning and the sound of her mother humming while she worked. Those memories lived inside her like a small steady flame, kept alive even after the house had been taken and the garden trampled. The loss sat in her chest as a quiet ache, but it also gave her steps purpose. Every careful movement through the swamp was a way of protecting what remained, the land itself, the people still hidden in the villages, the hope that one day the light might fall through windows again without fear. She carried that hope the way she carried the message, close and protected. The older man behind her carried his own memories. He thought of his wife, who had stayed in the village to tend what little they had left. He thought of the letters he had written to her in the quiet hours before leaving on these journeys, letters he folded and hid until he could find a way to send them. In his mind he could still see her face as she had looked the last time they parted, her hand raised in a wave that said both goodbye and come back safe. The memory steadied him when the swamp grew especially dark or when the sound of distant movement made his heart beat faster. He did not speak of the fear. It was there, a cold thread running beneath his ribs, but he had learned to walk with it the way one learns to walk with an old injury. It did not stop him. It simply reminded him to move with care. The boy between them watched the young woman's back and tried to place his feet exactly where she placed hers. He was learning the paths the way she had once learned them, through watching and through the quiet guidance of those who knew. His private fear lived in the small moments when the mud sucked harder at his boots or when a branch snapped somewhere nearby. He thought of his parents, who had told him to stay close to the older ones and to remember that courage was not the absence of fear but the choice to keep moving anyway. He carried a small stone in his pocket, smooth from being held, a gift from his little sister before he left. Sometimes he would touch it through the fabric of his coat, the cool surface a reminder that someone waited for him to return. The stone and the memory of his sister's face gave him the quiet strength to keep his steps even when the swamp tried to pull him down. They moved through the night in this way, the mist wrapping around them like a shawl. At one point the older man's foot slipped on a hidden root and he stumbled. The young woman turned without a word and offered her hand. He took it, his grip steady, and together they found the firmer ground again. The boy watched this small exchange and felt something loosen in his chest. Kindness in a place like this was not loud. It was the steady hand, the shared glance that said, "I am here with you," the way one person's knowledge of the path could help another stay upright. Later, when they paused in a small clearing where the trees grew closer and the mist thinned a little, the young woman took a piece of bread from her pocket and broke it into 3 parts. She gave one to the older man and one to the boy without speaking. They ate slowly, the bread tasting of home and of the careful hands that had baked it days before. The sharing was its own kind of message, one that needed no folding or hiding. In the quiet of the clearing they rested for a short while. The young woman took the folded message from its protected place and checked that the damp had not reached it. She thought of the person who would receive it, someone she might never meet, someone whose own footsteps would carry the words further. The responsibility felt large in her hands, but it also felt like an honor. This was how the hidden strength moved, not in grand gestures, but in the patient passing of small, careful things from one person to another. She tucked the message away again and looked at her companions. The older man's eyes were closed, his face calm in the way of someone who had learned to rest even in the middle of danger. The boy sat with his hand in his pocket, touching the stone. In that moment the young woman felt the fierce, protective love for the land rise inside her again. These swamps and forests had raised her. They had taught her their secrets. Now she and those like her were teaching the land how to protect its people in return. When they rose to continue, the older man placed a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of all the nights he had walked these paths and all the mornings he had returned. The boy straightened a little and matched his steps to the young woman's once more. They moved deeper into the swamp, the water lapping softly at the edges of the paths they followed. The mist grew thicker again, wrapping the trees in white until the world seemed to shrink to the small circle of their movement. In that circle lived the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing what needed to be done. The young woman thought of her mother's garden and the way the vegetables had pushed up through the soil each spring no matter what happened above ground. She thought of the way the land itself endured. Her footsteps became a kind of answer to that endurance, a promise that she would keep moving, keep carrying, keep protecting in the only way she knew how. The older man walked with his memories close. He thought of the letters he had written and the ones he hoped to receive. He thought of his wife's hands, strong from years of work, and the way they had felt the last time he held them. The fear for her safety lived alongside the love, but neither one stopped his steps. Instead, they gave his movement meaning. Every careful placement of his foot was a way of saying he would return if he could, that the land they both loved would one day be a place where they could sit together again without the need for hidden messages or nighttime journeys. The boy between them listened to the soft sounds of the swamp and felt the stone in his pocket like a small heartbeat. He was learning that courage could look like this, walking through difficult ground with people who knew the way, sharing bread when there was little to share, carrying a message or a memory without letting it weigh you down completely. They walked for a long time in this way, the night deepening around them. At one point they paused again when the young woman raised her hand. They stood still, listening. The sound of distant movement reached them through the trees, but it stayed far away, like something happening in another world. The young woman's heart beat faster for a moment, the private fear rising like the mist. Then she breathed slowly, the way her father had taught her when she was small and the swamp had felt too big. The fear settled back into something she could carry. She nodded to the others, and they moved again, their footsteps as quiet as before. The land seemed to approve of their care. The water did not pull them down. The trees did not catch at their clothes. The mist stayed soft rather than choking. In return for their respect, the swamp offered its protection, hiding them as it had hidden others before them. When they finally reached the place where the message needed to be left, the young woman took it out one last time. She placed it in a spot known only to those who walked these paths, covering it with a piece of bark and a handful of leaves so that it looked like nothing more than the forest floor. The older man watched with quiet approval. The boy stood close, learning how a message could travel without a voice or a face. They did not linger. The return journey would be just as careful, just as long. But as they turned to go, the young woman felt a small lift in her chest. The message was on its way. The hope it carried would move through other hands, other footsteps, other nights like this one. She thought of her mother's garden again, of the way new growth always found a way through the soil. Her own footsteps felt like that growth now, pushing forward even when the ground tried to hold them back. The older man walked beside her on the way back, his steps a little lighter now that the message had been delivered. He thought of the letter he would write when he returned to his village, the one that would tell his wife he was safe for another night. He would not mention the swamp or the mist or the fear that had walked with them. He would write instead of the way the land had held them, of the small kindnesses shared along the path, of the quiet strength that came from moving together. The boy between them touched the stone in his pocket and thought of his sister. He would tell her one day about the footsteps through the swamps, about the way the mist had wrapped around them like a promise that they were not alone. For now he simply walked, his feet learning the rhythm that had carried the young woman and the older man through so many nights. The swamp continued to hold its own quiet watch as they made their way home. The mist rose and fell with the breath of the water. The trees stood tall, their roots deep in the same soil that had raised the people who now moved through them with such care. In the villages beyond the swamp, others waited. Some knew of the footsteps that traveled in the night. Others simply lived their days with the same quiet resilience, tending what they could, remembering what they loved, and holding hope like a small flame against the darkness. The young woman, the older man, and the boy carried that hope with them as they walked, their footsteps a gentle but unyielding answer to everything that had tried to silence it. The land remembered their passing. The water kept their secrets. And in the soft rhythm of their movement through the mist, the fierce, protective love for home and for each other found its quiet expression, one careful step at a time, through the swamps that had taught them how to endure. For those who wish to go deeper into these hidden networks of courage, our Patreon community offers free podcasts, extended raw video segments without blurring, and a warm circle of fellow history lovers who believe, like you, that remembering the personal side of history heals us all. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The footsteps continued long after that night, moving through the swamps and forests whenever the need arose. The young woman taught others the safe paths. The older man wrote his letters and passed his knowledge to those who came after him. The boy grew into his own quiet strength, the stone from his sister still carried in his pocket as a reminder of what waited on the other side of the mist. The land held them all, its difficult beauty becoming their protection and their purpose. In the hush of the swamps, where the water lapped softly and the mist rose like a gentle veil, the quiet work of carrying hope forward went on. It asked for no recognition. It simply continued, one steady footfall after another, guided by memory, sustained by kindness, and rooted in the fierce love for a home that refused to be forgotten. The trees leaned close. The water kept its secrets. And the people who knew the hidden ways kept walking, their footsteps a soft but enduring promise that even in the darkest places, light could still find a path through. Under the wide and watching stars, the ink flowed slowly across paper that might never find its way home, yet the words kept coming as if they could hold the night itself together. In the quiet spaces where the trees stood tall and the land stretched into darkness, people sat with pen and paper close to their hearts. Some were far from the places they called home, their shelters simple and the night air cool against their skin. Others moved through villages or along hidden edges of the forest, carrying the same need to put words down before the darkness grew too deep. The act of writing was its own kind of light. The scratch of the pen against paper made a soft sound, like a small voice speaking in the stillness. The ink left marks that felt permanent even when the paper was folded and tucked away. In those marks lived the things that could not be spoken aloud, the longing for a familiar face, the worry that pressed quietly on the chest, the small hopes that refused to fade. A young soldier sat with his back against a tree, the paper balanced on his knee. The stars above gave just enough light to see the lines he wrote. He wrote to his mother, telling her about the way the wind moved through the branches in the evening and how it reminded him of the orchard behind their house. He did not write of the weight he carried or the uncertainty that lived in every quiet hour. Instead, he described the taste of tea made over a small fire and the way the steam rose like a memory of warmer days. His hand moved slowly, each word chosen with care so that the letter would feel like a visit rather than a goodbye. When he finished a page, he folded it gently and slipped it into the envelope he kept in his pocket. The envelope was already worn from being opened and closed many times, though it had never yet been sent. He held it for a moment against his chest before returning it to its place. The simple act of writing had loosened something inside him. The fears that had sat heavy during the day felt a little lighter now, as if the paper had taken some of their weight and turned it into words that could travel even if he could not. Nearby, another man wrote by the same soft starlight. He was older, with hands that moved more deliberately. His letter was for his wife and children. He wrote of the small things he missed most, the sound of their voices in the morning, the way his youngest would run to meet him at the door, the warmth of the kitchen when bread was baking. He paused often, the pen hovering above the paper as he searched for the right words. Sometimes the ink would pool a little where he hesitated, the dark spot spreading slowly before he continued. These pauses were not empty. They held the private fears he could not bring himself to name on the page, the fear that the letter might arrive too late, or that the faces he loved might change in ways he would not recognize when he returned. Yet he kept writing. The act itself was a quiet form of courage. It was a way of saying that love could still reach across the distance, even when the world felt uncertain and large. When he finished, he folded the letter with the same care he had once used to tuck his children into bed. He placed it inside his coat, close to his heart, where it would stay until he found a way to send it or until the night grew quiet enough for him to read it to himself again. In a small village not far from the forest edge, a woman sat at a table near the window where the starlight fell in a pale square on the wooden surface. She wrote to her son, who had gone away some time before. Her hand moved steadily, the pen leaving lines that spoke of the garden she tended and the way the vegetables were coming along despite the difficulties of the season. She wrote of the neighbors who still shared what they could and of the small kindnesses that kept the days from feeling too heavy. She did not write of the empty chair at the table or the way she sometimes woke in the night listening for footsteps that did not come. Those things lived in the spaces between her words. When she finished, she read the letter over once, her finger tracing the lines as if she could send the feeling of her hand along with the ink. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer where she kept all the letters she had written but not yet been able to send. Each one was a small bridge she had built in the quiet hours. Together they formed a quiet record of her love and her hope, a record that no one else might ever read but that helped her remember who she was when the world around her felt unsteady. Farther along the lines, in another simple shelter, a group of men sat together in the low light of a single small flame. One of them was writing while the others waited their turn with the paper and pen. The writer paused often to ask the others for help with a word or a memory. They spoke in low voices, sharing small stories of home that could be shaped into letters. One man described the street where he had grown up, the way the cobblestones felt under his feet after rain. Another spoke of his sister's laugh and how it could fill a whole room. These stories were passed gently from one to another, like bread being shared at a table. When the letter was finished, the writer read it aloud in a soft voice so that everyone could hear the words that now belonged to all of them. There was a moment of quiet after he finished, a shared stillness that felt like kindness. Then another man took the pen and began his own letter, the ink flowing again under the same careful hands. The small flame flickered but did not go out, its light steady enough for the writing to continue. On another evening, a young woman who moved through the forests with quiet steps sat near a small fire that had been built low so it would not draw attention. She held a piece of paper that had been given to her by someone she trusted. On it she wrote a message that would travel further than she could go herself. The words were simple and clear, but they carried the weight of many hopes. As she wrote, she thought of her own family and the home she had left behind. She remembered the way her grandmother had taught her to write when she was small, the patient hand guiding hers across the page. That memory gave her strength now. She wrote with the same patience, making sure each word was clear so that the message would reach its destination safely. When she finished, she folded the paper and tucked it into a hidden place in her coat. The act of writing had connected her to something larger than her own fear. It had reminded her that even in separation, people could still reach toward one another through the simple, enduring act of putting words on paper. The ink on all these pages dried slowly in the night air. Sometimes a drop would linger longer than expected, the dark spot spreading a little before it settled into the fibers of the paper. Those small imperfections became part of the letters themselves, marks of the hands that had written them and the hearts that had guided the words. The writers did not mind. They understood that the letters were not meant to be perfect. They were meant to carry what could not be carried any other way, the feeling of a hand on a shoulder, the sound of a voice saying a name, the quiet promise that someone was thinking of them across the distance. When the letters were finished and folded, the writers often sat for a while longer under the stars. They did not always speak. The writing had already said what needed to be said. The quiet that followed was its own kind of comfort, a space where the heart could rest after giving so much of itself to the page. In the villages and along the edges of the forests, the same gentle work continued night after night. A father wrote to his daughter, telling her stories of the stars he could see from where he sat. A sister wrote to her brother, describing the way the garden had changed since he left and how she was learning to tend it in his place. A friend wrote to a friend, remembering the small jokes they had shared and the way laughter had once made the hardest days feel lighter. These letters traveled in pockets and baskets and hidden linings. Some would reach their destinations. Others would remain folded, carried close until the time came when they could be read aloud or kept as quiet treasures. The ink that had flowed across the pages became a kind of thread, connecting hearts that the world had pulled apart. It did not dry completely in the way that ordinary ink might. It stayed alive in the memories of those who had written and those who would one day receive the words. The comfort found in this writing was quiet and deep. It did not take away the private fears or the weight of separation. Instead, it gave those fears a place to rest. By putting them into words, even the ones left unspoken between the lines, the writers made room for the tender promises that lived alongside them. They remembered who they were beyond the long days and the uncertain nights. They remembered the faces they loved, the homes they carried inside them, the small joys that had once filled their ordinary hours. The act of writing became a form of everyday heroism, a gentle refusal to let the distance or the darkness erase what mattered most. It asked for no recognition. It simply continued, one careful word after another, under the same watching stars that had seen so many such letters written in so many such nights. Before we continue, I warmly invite you to join our free weekly email newsletter. As a thank you, you will receive the beautiful ebook The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, filled with forgotten tales of courage and hidden heroes that echo the secret networks of hope we have been exploring together. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The stars continued their slow passage across the sky as the writers tucked their letters away and settled into what rest they could find. Some would rise again before dawn to begin another day of careful movement. Others would carry their folded papers with them as they walked the hidden paths or tended the small gardens that still grew in the villages. The ink on the pages had dried, but the feeling it carried remained fresh. It lived in the way a hand might touch a pocket where a letter waited, and the way eyes might close for a moment to remember a face described in careful words, and the way hope continued to move forward even when the night felt long. The land around them held its own quiet watch, the trees standing tall and the water in the distant swamps reflecting the same stars that had witnessed the writing. In this shared stillness, the letters became part of something larger than any single page or any single heart. They became threads in a gentle web of remembrance, connecting the present moment to the homes and the loves that waited somewhere beyond the darkness. The ink that would not fully dry was the ink of the heart itself, flowing steadily through every careful word, every folded paper, every quiet promise that love could still travel, even across the widest distances and the longest nights. In the hush before the first soft tremor reached them, a young soldier broke his bread and offered half to the comrade beside him, their quiet laughter rising like a small light against the vast dark. The night lay deep over the land. Stars scattered across the sky in quiet patterns, and the air carried the cool scent of earth and leaves. In a simple shelter built against the side of a low rise, 2 soldiers sat close together. The ground beneath them felt steady for now, though far away a low sound had begun to move through the darkness like distant thunder rolling closer. The young soldier held the piece of bread in his hands for a moment before breaking it. It was not much, just what he had saved from earlier in the day, but he split it evenly and placed one half into the hand of the man next to him. The gesture was simple, without words at first. The other soldier looked at the bread, then at the young man's face, and something in his eyes softened. He took the bread and held it for a moment as if it were more than food. Then he nodded, and the 2 of them ate slowly in the quiet. The laughter came after, low and brief, when the young soldier made a small joke about how the bread tasted better when shared under stars than it ever had in any kitchen he remembered. It was not loud laughter. It was the kind that lived in the chest and escaped softly, a small rebellion against the weight of what they both felt gathering in the air. The comrade smiled in return, the lines around his eyes easing for a moment. They did not speak of the low sound moving toward them or of the way the earth had begun to answer it with a faint shiver. Instead, they spoke of small things. The young soldier mentioned the way the wind had felt against his face earlier that evening, cool and carrying the memory of rain somewhere far off. The other man replied with a story about his own village, where the wind sometimes carried the scent of pine from the hills behind his home. These words were ordinary, but they carried a quiet strength. They reminded both men that they were still themselves, still connected to places and people beyond the night that surrounded them. The young soldier thought of his family as he ate. He carried a letter in his pocket that he had received some days before, the paper now soft from being read many times. In it his mother had written of the garden and how the vegetables were growing well despite everything. She had not asked when he would return. She had simply described the way the light fell across the kitchen table in the late afternoon, as if she knew he would need to hold that image in his mind. He had not written back yet. There had not been time, or perhaps the words had felt too large for the small paper he carried. Now, with the ground beginning to tremble beneath him, he wished he had found the time. The thought sat gently inside him, not as regret but as a quiet reminder of what waited on the other side of whatever was coming. He touched the pocket where the letter rested and felt its presence like a small steady hand. The comrade beside him was older, with a face that had seen many such nights. He too carried memories close. In his own pocket was a small photograph, its edges worn smooth from being held. He did not take it out now. Instead he spoke of his daughter, how she had once tried to teach him a song she learned at school and how he had sung it badly but with great seriousness until she laughed. The story came out slowly, between bites of the shared bread. The young soldier listened, and when the story ended he offered a piece of his own memory in return, the way his younger brother had once followed him everywhere, copying his walk and his words until the whole family teased them both. These small exchanges built a gentle bridge between them. They did not erase the private fears that lived in each man's chest, the fear of what the trembling earth meant, the fear of separation that might grow wider before it could close again, the fear of the unknown that waited beyond the next rise. But the sharing made the fears feel less alone. They became something that could be carried together for a little while. The earth trembled again, a little stronger this time. It was not a violent shaking. It was a soft, rolling movement that traveled up through the ground and into their bodies where they sat. The young soldier felt it in his bones and paused with the last bit of bread halfway to his mouth. The comrade looked at him, and for a moment their eyes met in the dim light. Neither spoke of the sound or the movement. Instead, the older man reached into his pack and brought out a small tin cup. He poured a little water from his own flask into it and handed it to the young soldier without a word. The gesture was as simple as the breaking of the bread had been. The young man took the cup, drank, and handed it back. In that exchange lived a quiet kindness that needed no explanation. It said, "I am here with you in this moment." It said, "We will face whatever comes with what little we have to share." Around them the night continued its slow turning. Other men in nearby shelters moved with the same quiet care. Some wrote short notes by the light of small shielded flames, words meant for home that might be sent later or kept close if sending became impossible. Others sat in silence, their hands resting on whatever small objects they carried for comfort, a smooth stone, a folded photograph, a letter already read many times. The low sound in the distance grew steadier, and the earth answered with another gentle tremor. It was as if the land itself was waking to something new, its old rhythms shifting in ways that could not yet be named. The young soldier and his comrade felt it together. They did not pull away from each other. Instead they stayed close, the shared bread now gone, the tin cup returned to its place. Their quiet laughter had faded, but the warmth it had left behind remained in the space between them. The young soldier thought again of the letter in his pocket. He wished he could add a line to it now, something simple like the way the stars looked tonight or how the bread had tasted when split in half. He knew he could not write in the dark, and there was no time for such things anyway. Yet the wish itself brought a small comfort. It reminded him that even in this moment of waiting and trembling, he was still the person who cared about such ordinary details. The comrade beside him seemed to sense this. He spoke again, his voice low and steady, telling another small story from home. This one was about a dog that had followed him everywhere as a boy, a loyal shadow that had once tried to chase away a storm by barking at the thunder. The story made the young soldier smile in the dark. It was the kind of story that belonged to childhood and to safety, and hearing it now felt like borrowing a little of that safety for the night. The earth trembled once more, and this time the sound that accompanied it was closer, a low rolling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The two men sat with it, their bodies absorbing the movement without resistance. The young soldier felt his heart beat a little faster, but he did not move away from his comrade. Instead, he reached out and rested his hand briefly on the older man's shoulder, a touch that said more than words could in that moment. The comrade covered the hand with his own for a second, then let go. The gesture was enough. It was the same kind of everyday courage that had been present in the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the water. It was the courage of staying present with another person when the ground itself seemed uncertain. In the shelters nearby, similar small acts unfolded. A man helped another adjust a blanket over his shoulders. Someone passed a piece of dried fruit to a comrade who had not eaten. Quiet words were exchanged, not about what was coming but about what had been left behind and what might still be waiting. These were not grand gestures. They were the gentle rebellions of ordinary hearts against the vast unknown. They said that even when the earth trembled and the night filled with sound, people could still choose to turn toward one another with what little they had. The young soldier and his comrade remained in their shelter, the stars above them unchanged even as the land beneath them shifted. They sat in the quiet that followed each tremor, their breathing steady, their presence a small steady light in the gathering dark. The night continued to deepen around them. The low sound grew more constant, and the tremors came more often, each one a soft reminder that something larger than any single heart was moving across the land. Yet inside the simple shelter, the two men held their small space of warmth and connection. The young soldier thought of his mother's letter and the garden she had described. He thought of the bread they had shared and the laughter that had followed. He thought of the hand on his shoulder and the tin cup passed without words. These things did not stop the trembling of the earth, but they gave it a different weight. They made the unknown feel less like something that would swallow them and more like something they could walk toward together, one small act of kindness at a time. In the spirit of that young soldier sharing his last piece of bread, perhaps you might find comfort in a carefully chosen piece of World War II memorabilia or the moving film Midway on Amazon Prime, which honors the small, everyday courage that appears in every corner of a vast conflict. It is a gentle way to hold close the stories of ordinary people who endured extraordinary times. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The stars kept their watch as the night moved forward. The earth continued its soft tremors, and the low sound rolled across the land like a slow wave finding its way to shore. In the shelters and along the quiet positions, men and women carried their small lights of connection forward. The young soldier and his comrade stayed close, their shared silence now filled with the memory of bread broken and water passed and stories told in low voices. They did not know what the coming hours would bring. They only knew that they had met the first soft tremor with what they had, a piece of bread, a quiet laugh, a steady hand, and the simple courage to remain present with each other when the ground itself began to change. That was enough for this night. It was the kind of enough that could be carried forward, one gentle step at a time, into whatever waited beyond the darkness. The land held them as it had always held those who walked upon it with care. The stars remained above, unchanging in their quiet patterns. And in the space between one tremor and the next, the small rebellions of kindness and connection continued, steady and unassuming, like the bread that had been shared and the laughter that had risen softly against the vast unknown. In the mist that wrapped the land like a soft gray shawl, soldiers found themselves inside a circle that grew smaller with each passing hour, yet in that shrinking space they discovered moments of unexpected grace. The fog rose from the earth and the low places, thick and cool, turning trees into shadows and paths into suggestions rather than certainties. Inside this gentle but insistent veil, men moved or stayed still, their senses reaching outward for what they could not clearly see. The air carried the damp smell of soil and leaves, and sounds traveled strangely, sometimes close and sometimes far, as if the mist itself decided what could be heard. In small depressions in the ground or behind low rises, soldiers gathered in twos and threes, their shoulders touching or nearly touching, their faces close enough that expressions could be read even when words were few. A young soldier sat with his back against the damp earth, his knees drawn up. Beside him was an older man whose face showed years of walking similar paths in other places. Between them lay a single cigarette, passed from one hand to the other without ceremony. The young man took a slow draw, the smoke mixing with the mist, then handed it back. Their fingers brushed briefly, a small contact that said more than the silence between them. Neither spoke of the way the ground had changed or the way the space around them had grown tighter. Instead, the older man said something quiet about the way the fog reminded him of mornings on a river near his home, where mist would rise from the water and make the world feel smaller and kinder for a little while. The young soldier listened, and when it was his turn he spoke of a valley he knew, where the same kind of fog would settle in the evenings and make the hills disappear until only the nearest trees remained. These words were ordinary, but they built a small bridge across the distance that separated their lives before this moment. The cigarette passed again. The smoke rose and disappeared into the larger gray. In that simple sharing lived a quiet kindness that asked for nothing in return. The young soldier felt his private fears settle a little. He had been carrying the weight of not knowing what would come next, of feeling the circle close without being able to see its edges. The older man's presence and the shared smoke made the fear feel less like something he had to face alone. He thought of a letter he had written days earlier, one he had folded carefully and kept close, the words inside speaking of home and of the small hopes that had seemed so ordinary then. He did not take the letter out now. Instead, he let the memory of writing it steady him, the same way the cigarette and the quiet words steadied him. The act of remembering who he had been before the mist arrived gave him a small piece of himself to hold on to. Nearby, in another small hollow where the mist gathered thickest, two other men sat without speaking for a long time. One was from a place far to the east, the other from lands that had once felt distant in a different way. The divide between them had once been wide, but inside the tightening circle it had narrowed to the space of a shared glance. The first man reached into his pocket and brought out a small tin. He opened it and offered what was inside without looking directly at the other. It was only a bit of dried bread, hard from being carried, but the gesture was enough. The second man took a piece, nodded once, and ate slowly. Their eyes met for a moment in the gray light, and in that look passed an understanding that needed no translation. Both had been stripped of the larger stories they had carried about who the other was. What remained was the simple fact of two men sharing what little they had while the mist held them close and the world outside grew uncertain. The older soldier in the first hollow spoke again, his voice low and steady. He told of a winter long ago when he and his brothers had been caught in a similar fog while bringing wood home from the forest. They had stayed close, passing a small flask between them, telling stories to keep the cold from settling too deeply into their bones. The young soldier listened and felt something loosen inside his chest. The story was not about the present moment, yet it carried a quiet lesson about enduring together. He thought of his own comrades who were somewhere in the mist, perhaps in other hollows, perhaps moving carefully through the trees. He hoped they had someone beside them, someone to share a glance or a word or a small piece of what they carried. The thought itself became a kind of kindness he could offer even from a distance. The mist thickened in places, turning the nearest trees into soft shapes that could have been anything. Sounds came and went without clear direction. Sometimes a low voice called from nearby, and sometimes the call seemed to come from much farther away. The men in the hollows did not answer loudly. They stayed with the small circle they had made with their presence. The cigarette burned down to a stub and was carefully extinguished. The tin of bread was closed and returned to its pocket. These small actions were performed with the same care one might use for something precious, because in that moment they were precious. They were the ordinary acts that kept fear from growing larger than it needed to be. The young soldier thought of home again, not with the sharp ache he sometimes felt, but with a gentler longing. He remembered the way his mother would leave a light in the window on nights when he was expected back late. The memory was small and ordinary, yet it gave him something solid to hold inside while the mist made everything outside uncertain. He wondered if somewhere in another part of the circle someone else was remembering a similar light, a similar face, a similar small comfort. The thought connected him to the larger web of people who were also sitting in small hollows or moving carefully through the fog, each carrying their own private fears and their own quiet strengths. The older man beside him shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing the young soldier's for a moment. It was not an accident, but it was not dramatic either. It was simply the way one person reminded another that they were not alone inside the gray. The young soldier did not pull away. He let the contact remain, and in that small, steady presence he found a piece of unexpected grace. The grand stories of what this moment meant had fallen away. What remained were these quiet exchanges, the cigarette, the story, the touch of a shoulder, the shared bread. These were the things that could still be offered when everything else felt out of reach. In another place within the mist, a man helped another who had stumbled on uneven ground. He offered his hand without speaking, pulled the other upright, and then stepped back as if the help had been nothing more than a natural part of moving through the same fog. The one who had stumbled nodded once, a small acknowledgement that said thank you without needing words. These gestures happened again and again across the tightening space. They were not planned. They rose from the simple recognition that inside the circle, every person was carrying something heavy, and sometimes the lightest touch or the smallest offering could make the weight a little easier to bear. The young soldier and the older man sat in their hollow as the mist continued to move around them. They did not know how long they would remain there or what would happen when the gray finally thinned. They only knew that in this moment they had each other's presence and the small kindnesses they could still give. The private fears remained, the fear of what waited beyond the mist, the fear of losing the small connections they had made, the fear of the unknown that the tightening circle represented. But those fears were met with the same quiet resilience that had allowed them to share the cigarette and the story and the touch. The resilience did not shout. It simply continued, one small act after another, inside the gray that held them. Just as these men found unexpected grace inside the tightening circle, our Gumroad collection offers a rare digital treasury of uncensored wartime photographs and raw personal accounts from the Eastern Front, material too stark and real for open platforms. It lets you witness the unvarnished human side that history often softens. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The mist stayed with them as the hours passed. It did not lift, but it also did not grow heavier. It simply remained, a soft boundary that made the world small enough to hold in the space between two men sharing what they had. The young soldier thought again of the letter in his pocket and of the light his mother would leave in the window. He thought of the comrade beside him and of the story about the winter fog and the brothers bringing wood home. He thought of the cigarette smoke rising and disappearing and of the bread broken and shared. These thoughts did not change the circle that continued to close around them, but they changed the way the closing felt. It became something that could be met with presence rather than only with fear. The older man beside him seemed to carry the same understanding. He sat quietly, his breathing steady, his presence a small steady light inside the gray. In other hollows and along other low rises, similar scenes unfolded. Men reached across whatever divides had once seemed important and offered what they could, a glance, a word, a piece of bread, a steadying hand. The mist received these offerings without judgment. It simply held the space where they could happen. The land beneath the fog continued its slow turning, and the men inside the circle continued their small, quiet work of remaining human when everything else felt uncertain. The grace they found was not loud or grand. It was the grace of two hands passing a cigarette, of a story told in a low voice, of a shoulder offered in silence. It was the grace of remembering, even for a little while, that they were more than the circle that held them. There were people who could still choose kindness when kindness was all that remained to give. The mist kept its secrets, and the men kept their small lights burning inside it, one shared moment at a time. In the soft light that lingered near the water's edge, a hand reached out across the mud to steady another, and for a moment the river's pull felt less certain than the quiet strength passing between two strangers. The river moved slowly, its surface dark and patient, carrying the memory of rains that had fallen days before. Along its banks the ground had turned to thick mud that clung to boots and made every step reluctant. Shattered remains of what had once been bridges lay half submerged, their broken timbers like old bones half buried in the silt. Men moved along the shore in small groups or alone, their shapes softened by the low light and the mist that rose from the water. Some carried what they could on their backs. Others helped those who moved more slowly. The river did not hurry them. It simply waited, its current steady and indifferent, while the people on its banks found their own ways across. A young soldier stood at the edge where the mud met the water. His boots were already heavy with the thick earth, and he looked across to the far bank as if measuring something he could not quite name. Beside him an older man sat on a fallen log, his breath coming in low, even rhythms. The older man's leg had been giving him trouble for days, though he spoke little of it. When the time came to move, the young soldier stepped closer and offered his hand without a word. The older man took it, his grip steady despite the pain that showed briefly in his face. Together they found a way down the slippery bank, the young man's feet searching for solid places while the older man leaned on the offered arm. The mud sucked at their boots with each step, but they moved together, one careful placement after another. The river's sound was low and constant, a murmur that seemed to carry both invitation and warning. As they reached the water's edge, the young soldier paused. He looked at the older man and saw the weariness there, the same weariness he felt in his own chest. He thought of a letter he had written some nights earlier, the one he had folded and kept close, the words inside speaking of home and of the small hopes that still lived there. He had not been able to send it yet. Now, standing at the river, he wondered if the words would still feel true on the other side. The thought was not heavy. It simply sat beside the need to keep moving, one reluctant step after another. They found a place where the water ran shallower, though the current still pulled at their legs when they stepped in. The young soldier went first, testing each footfall, then turned and offered his hand again. The older man took it, and together they crossed, the water rising to their knees and then to their thighs. The cold seeped through their clothes, but the steady grip between them kept the chill from settling too deeply into their bones. Halfway across, the older man's foot slipped on a hidden stone. He would have gone under if the young soldier had not tightened his hold and pulled him upright again. For a moment they stood in the moving water, breathing hard, the current pressing against their legs. Neither spoke. The young man simply waited until the older man nodded, and then they continued, one careful step after another, until the far bank rose to meet them. On the muddy shore they sat for a while, letting the water drain from their clothes. The older man reached into his coat and brought out a small piece of cloth. He tore it slowly and offered half to the young soldier, who took it and used it to wipe the worst of the mud from his face. The gesture was small, almost nothing, yet it carried a quiet kindness that needed no explanation. They sat in silence for a time, the river behind them and the land ahead still wrapped in the same low light. The young soldier thought of the letter again and of the home it described. He wondered if the people there were thinking of him at that same moment. The thought brought a gentle comfort, as if the distance between them had narrowed for a little while. Nearby, another group moved along the bank. A man helped a younger comrade who carried a heavy pack. He took part of the load without being asked, shifting the weight so that both could walk more easily. Their steps were slow and reluctant, but they did not stop. When they reached a place where the mud grew especially deep, the older of the two reached back and offered his hand. The younger man took it, and together they pulled free. A few words passed between them, low and steady, nothing that needed to be remembered later, only the sound of voices offering presence in a place where presence mattered. These small gestures happened again and again along the river. Hands reached out. Shoulders leaned against shoulders. A whispered word of encouragement passed from one to another when the mud pulled too hard or the water felt too cold. On the far bank, soldiers who had already crossed waited or moved onward in small groups. Some helped those still struggling in the shallows. A man extended a long branch to another who had lost his footing, pulling him the last few steps onto solid ground. The one who had been pulled sat for a moment, breathing hard, then looked up and nodded once. The nod carried more than thanks. It carried the recognition that courage could live in the simple act of not letting another fall. These moments did not erase the private fears that each man carried, the fear of what waited beyond the river, the fear of losing the small connections they had made, the fear of the unknown that the crossing represented. But the fears were met with the same quiet resilience that allowed hands to reach and voices to offer steady words. The young soldier and the older man eventually rose from their place on the bank. They did not speak of what had passed between them in the water. Instead, they began to walk again, their steps still heavy with mud but lighter now that the river was behind them. The young soldier touched the pocket where his letter rested. He thought of adding a line when he next had the chance, something simple about the way a hand had steadied him when the current pulled hardest. He knew the words would stay inside him for now, but the thought itself felt like a small promise kept. The older man walked beside him, his breathing easier than it had been on the other side. The small piece of cloth he had shared was now tucked away again, but the kindness it had carried remained in the space between them. Along the river, the crossings continued in their reluctant, careful way. Men and women found paths where the water ran less deep. They used broken timbers and fallen branches to steady themselves. They helped one another when the mud grew too thick or the current too strong. In these reluctant movements lived the everyday heroism of people who chose to keep moving even when every step asked something of them. A whispered prayer rose from one man as he helped another across a difficult stretch. The words were not loud. They were simply spoken into the space between two people who had found themselves side by side at a moment when side by side was what mattered most. The prayer was for the one being helped and for the one helping, and for all the others who were also finding their way across the reluctant water. The young soldier thought again of home as they walked. He thought of the faces he carried in his memory and of the letter that held some of his own words for them. The river had taken something from him, the last of the dryness in his clothes, the last of the certainty in his steps, but it had also given something back. It had given him the memory of a steady hand and a shared piece of cloth and the quiet understanding that courage could hide in the smallest gestures. These things did not make the larger unknown any smaller. They simply made it possible to keep walking toward it with a little more of himself intact. The older man beside him seemed to carry the same understanding. He walked with a slight limp, but his steps were sure. When they reached a place where the path divided, he paused and looked at the young soldier. No words were needed. The look itself said that they had crossed something together and that the crossing had changed them both in ways that did not need to be spoken. They chose a path and continued, the river now a low sound behind them, the land ahead still wrapped in the same gentle light that had accompanied their reluctant steps. The small gestures of courage we just witnessed remind us how much quiet dedication goes into preserving truth. If this story has moved you, a small tip on Ko-Fi, even $1, helps sustain the countless hours of research and care that go into bringing these forgotten human moments back to light for everyone who needs them. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The river continued its slow movement long after the last reluctant crossing had been made. Its banks held the marks of many feet and many hands that had reached for one another in the mud and the water. The men and women who had found their way across carried those marks with them, not on their bodies alone, but in the quiet way they now moved through the land beyond. They carried the memory of a steadying hand, of a shared piece of cloth, of a whispered word offered when words were all that remained to give. These memories became part of the quiet resilience that allowed them to keep walking, one step after another, into whatever waited ahead. The river had been reluctant, and so had they. Yet together they had found a way across, and in the finding they had discovered that courage often lives in the smallest gestures: a hand extended, a shoulder offered, a presence that says without words that no one needs to cross alone. The land received them on the far side with the same patient silence it had always held. The light stayed soft. The mud eventually dried on their boots. And the small kindnesses they had shared became the threads that held them together as they moved forward, one reluctant but steady step at a time. In the quiet space where the forest edge met the slow-moving river, a nurse paused among the wounded and offered water to a man whose uniform was different from her own, her eyes meeting his with the same tired gentleness that no border could divide. The light was soft and low, falling through the trees in pale shafts that touched the ground without sharpness. The river murmured nearby, its voice steady and patient, as if it had carried wounded people and their stories for longer than anyone could remember. Along the bank and in the shallow hollows where the trees stand, men lay or sat in small groups. Some were tended by others who moved with careful hands. Others rested with their eyes closed, their breathing low and even in the stillness. The air carried the cool dampness of the river and the deeper scent of earth and leaves from the forest behind them. In this place the larger movements of the world had slowed to the rhythm of small, necessary acts. The nurse moved among them with a tin cup in her hand. Her steps were steady but not hurried. She had been moving like this for hours, or perhaps it only felt that way because the tiredness had settled into her shoulders and her eyes. She stopped beside a man who lay with his back against a fallen log. His face was pale and streaked with mud and sweat. His uniform was torn in places, and his eyes were half closed against the light. She knelt beside him without speaking at first. The cup in her hand held water she had carried from the river, cool and clear. She held it out, and after a moment his eyes opened fully and found hers. There was no rush in the way she offered the water. She simply held the cup steady until he reached for it. His hand was unsteady, so she helped guide it to his lips. He drank slowly. When he finished, she took the cup back and set it on the ground beside her. For a little while neither of them spoke. The forest edge and the river held the silence between them. Then she spoke, her voice low and even, asking if he needed anything else. He shook his head once, a small movement that seemed to cost him something. She stayed kneeling for another moment, her eyes resting on his face. In that look lived the same exhaustion she had seen in every face she had tended that day, whether the uniform was like hers or not. The tiredness did not belong to one side or the other. It simply was, shared by anyone who had walked through these hours. She thought of a letter she had written some nights earlier, one she kept folded in her pocket when she could. In it she had told her sister about the small things she still noticed, the way light fell through leaves, the sound of water over stones, the way a hand could steady another when words were not enough. She had not written about the weight she carried or the faces she saw each day. Those things lived in the spaces between the lines she had written. Now, kneeling by the river's edge with this man whose eyes held the same tiredness as her own, she felt the truth of those unspoken lines. The mercy she offered was not grand. It was only water in a tin cup, a moment of stillness, a glance that said she saw him as someone who was also weary and also human. Nearby, another caregiver moved among the wounded. She carried a blanket that had been folded many times. She stopped beside a young man whose hands were wrapped in cloth and placed the blanket over his shoulders without speaking. The young man looked up at her, and something in his face eased. She touched his shoulder once, a light pressure that said she was there, then moved on to the next person who needed what she could give. These small gestures happened quietly, without announcement. They were the everyday ways people kept one another from falling too far into the exhaustion that wanted to claim them all. The man by the log closed his eyes again after drinking. The nurse stayed beside him a little longer. She thought of her own home, of the way her sister would be waiting for news that might not come for a long time. She thought of the letter in her pocket and of the words she had chosen so carefully so that they would carry comfort rather than the heaviness she sometimes felt. The act of writing that letter had been its own kind of mercy, a way of reaching across distance with something gentle. Now she reached across a different kind of distance with the water and the stillness. Both acts came from the same quiet place inside her, the place that refused to let exhaustion erase the simple truth that every person carried some version of the same tiredness and the same need for a steady hand or a kind word. The man opened his eyes once more and looked at her. He did not speak, but his expression had changed slightly. The hardness that had been there when she first knelt had softened. He lifted one hand in a small gesture, as if to say thank you, though no words came. She nodded once in return. The nod held no victory and no defeat. It was only recognition that they were both here, both weary, both still capable of offering or receiving a small mercy when everything else felt uncertain. She picked up the tin cup and rose slowly. Before she moved on, she adjusted the blanket that had slipped from his shoulders, tucking it more securely around him. The gesture was automatic, born of long practice, but it carried the same care she had given to the water. Around them the forest edge continued its quiet watch. The river kept its steady murmur. Other small acts of mercy unfolded in the low light. A man shared a piece of bread with another who had none. Someone helped a wounded comrade find a more comfortable position against a tree. A low voice offered a story from home to someone who could not sleep, the words spoken gently so they would not disturb the others resting nearby. These moments did not change the larger situation that had brought them all to this place. They simply made the place more bearable, more human, for as long as the moments lasted. The nurse moved to another person who needed water. She filled the cup again from the river and carried it carefully so none would spill. As she walked, she thought of the man by the log and of the way his eyes had met hers. She thought of how the same exhaustion had looked out from both their faces. The thought did not bring sadness. It brought a quiet steadiness. It reminded her that the flicker of humanity she had seen in him lived in her as well, and in everyone else who was moving through these hours with whatever strength they still carried. The mercy she offered was not only for him. It was also for herself, a way of remembering that she could still choose gentleness even when gentleness asked something of her tired hands and tired eyes. She knelt beside the next person and offered the water in the same unhurried way. The person took it and drank, and for a moment their eyes met as well. In that meeting lived the same recognition she had felt with the man by the log. The uniform was different, the story behind the face was different, but the tiredness and the need for a steady presence were the same. She stayed until the cup was empty, then rose and continued her slow circuit along the bank. The river's sound accompanied her steps. The forest edge held its shadows close. And in the space between one act of mercy and the next, the quiet resilience of ordinary people doing what they could continued without fanfare. For those who wish to go deeper into these hidden networks of courage, our Patreon community offers free podcasts, extended raw video segments without blurring, and a warm circle of fellow history lovers who believe, like you, that remembering the personal side of history heals us all. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The light stayed soft as the hours moved forward. The nurse continued her work, the tin cup refilled again and again from the river that gave what it could. The man by the log rested with the blanket tucked around him, his breathing even now. Others around him found their own small comforts, a shared word, a piece of bread, a hand that reached out when reaching was all that was left to offer. The forest edge and the river held them all without judgment. They simply were there, witnesses to the mercy that rose in small, steady waves from tired hearts that refused to let exhaustion have the final word. The nurse thought again of her letter and of the home it carried inside its folded pages. She thought of the eyes that had met hers and of the water that had passed from her hands to another's lips. These things did not erase the weight of the day. They simply made the weight something that could be carried a little farther, one gentle act at a time. In the quiet space where the forest met the river, the flicker of humanity continued to burn, small and steady, and every cup of water offered, every blanket adjusted, every glance that said without words that no one here was alone in their tiredness. The land held them. The water gave what it could. And the people who moved among the wounded kept choosing, again and again, the small mercies that reminded them all of who they still were beneath the exhaustion and the uncertainty. In the soft glow of a small fire built low against the night, soldiers paused on the path that led forward, their faces lit by flickering light while stories of home rose with the smoke and gave them strength to keep moving. The fire crackled gently, its flames dancing in small, steady patterns that pushed back just enough of the darkness to make faces visible. Around it, men sat or lay close, their bodies heavy with the tiredness that comes from long days of movement. The smoke rose in thin curls, carrying the scent of wood and earth, and sometimes it seemed to carry the stories upward as well, as if the night itself could hold what was spoken in the low voices. The path they had traveled lay behind them, marked by the places they had passed, and the path ahead stretched into shadows that the fire could not reach. For now, in this small circle of light, they rested. A young soldier sat with his back against the log, his hands held out toward the warmth. He had been driving for hours, or perhaps it only felt that way because the tiredness had settled into his shoulders and his eyes. Beside him an older man stirred a small pot over the fire, the smell of something simple rising with the smoke. When the older man spoke, his voice was low and even, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had learned to save his words for when they mattered. He told of a garden he had left behind, of the way the vegetables grew even when the season was difficult, and of how his wife would walk among the rows in the evening, touching the leaves as if to encourage them. The young soldier listened without interrupting. The story was not about the garden itself. It was about the hands that tended it and the quiet hope that lived in that tending. When the older man finished, he ladled some of the simple stew into a tin cup and passed it to the young soldier. Their fingers touched briefly on the warm metal, and in that small contact lived a kindness that needed no words. The young soldier drank slowly. The warmth spread through him, loosening the tight place in his chest that had been there since the last time they had stopped. He thought of his own home, of the letter he carried in his pocket that he had read so many times the paper had grown soft. And it his mother had written of the way the light fell through the kitchen window in the late afternoon and of how she still set a place at the table even when she knew he would not be there to fill it. He had not written back yet. There had been no time, or perhaps the words had felt too large for the small paper he carried. Now, with the fire crackling and the smoke rising, he wished he had found a way to add a line about this moment, the fire, the story of the garden, the cup passed from one hand to another. The thought was gentle rather than heavy. It reminded him that even on this path, where every step asked something of him, he was still connected to the place and the people he carried inside him. Across the fire, another man spoke in a low voice. He told of a street in his village where the cobblestones caught the rain and turned silver in the light from the windows. He spoke of his daughter, how she would run to meet him when he returned from the fields, her small hands reaching up as if she could pull him the rest of the way home. The story came slowly, between sips from his own cup, and when he finished there was a quiet that settled around the fire like the smoke itself. No one rushed to fill it. The quiet was its own kind of sharing, a space where each man could hold his own memories for a moment before the path called them forward again. The young soldier thought of the letter in his pocket and of the words his mother had chosen so carefully. He wondered if she was sitting at that same kitchen table now, perhaps looking out the window at the same light she had described. The thought brought a small steadiness. It did not take away the tiredness or the private fears that lived in the space between one story and the next, the fear of what the path ahead might ask of them, the fear of losing the small connections they had made with one another, the fear of the unknown that waited beyond the next rise. But the fears felt less sharp when held alongside the stories of gardens and streets and daughters running to meet their fathers. These stories were ordinary, yet they carried a quiet strength that could be borrowed for a little while. One of the men rose and added another small branch to the fire. The flames caught and rose higher for a moment, throwing new shadows across the faces around the circle. He sat down again and passed a piece of bread to the man beside him without being asked. The bread was hard from being carried, but it was shared evenly, broken by hand and passed from one to another until everyone had a piece. The young soldier took his share and ate slowly, tasting not only the bread but the kindness that had offered it. In return, he reached into his pack and brought out a small tin of something he had been saving. He opened it and passed it around, a simple offering that said he too had something to give. These exchanges happened without ceremony. There were the small rebellions against exhaustion that allowed them to keep moving when the path asked for more than they thought they had left to give. The older man who had told the story of the garden spoke again. This time his voice was even softer, as if the words were meant more for himself than for the others. He spoke of the way his wife would leave a light in the window on nights when he was expected home late. The light was never bright, just a small flame that said someone was waiting. He had carried the memory of that light with him for a long time, and sometimes when the path grew difficult he would think of it and feel a little less alone. The young soldier listened and felt something loosen inside his chest. He thought of his mother's letter and of the place she still sat at the table. He thought of the light she might be leaving in her own window, even if she did not speak of it in her letters. The thought connected him to the older man and to the others around the fire who were also carrying their own lights from home. They sat for a while longer in the circle of warmth. The fire burned lower, and the smoke rose more slowly now, carrying the last of the stories upward into the night. One by one the men settled into what rest they could find, some lying close to the fire with their coats pulled around them, others sitting with their backs against logs or trees. The young soldier stayed awake a little longer, the letter in his pocket a small weight against his chest. He thought of adding to it when there was time, of writing about the fire and the stories and the way a cup of something warm could loosen the tiredness for a little while. He knew the words might never be sent, but the act of thinking them felt like a promise he could keep to himself. It reminded him that even on this path through smoke and memory, he was still the person who noticed the small kindnesses and the ordinary stories that gave strength. The older man beside him had already closed his eyes, but his breathing was steady and even. The young soldier watched the firelight play across his face and thought of the garden he had described and of the hands that tended it. He thought of the light in the window and of the daughter running to meet her father. These images lived alongside his own memories now, shared without being asked for, given freely around the fire. The sharing had not taken anything away from any of them. It had only added something, a small piece of someone else's home to carry alongside their own. That addition made the path ahead feel a little less long and a little less alone. In the hours before they would rise again, the fire continued its quiet work. It warmed the hands that reached toward it and lit the faces that turned to it. It received the stories that were offered and sent the smoke upward carrying the scent of wood and earth and the memory of home. The soldiers who rested around it carried their private fears and their quiet resilience in equal measure. The fears did not disappear in the firelight, but they were met with the same gentle strength that allowed hands to pass bread and cups and stories. The resilience showed itself in the choice to keep moving when the path asked for more, and in the choice to pause and share when pausing was all they had left to give. Before we continue, I warmly invite you to join our free weekly email newsletter. As a thank you, you will receive the beautiful ebook The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, filled with forgotten tales of courage and hidden heroes that echo the quiet strength found around those flickering campfires. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The night continued its slow turning around the small fire. The smoke rose and disappeared into the larger darkness, carrying with it the last of the stories and the warmth of the shared moments. When the men rose again, they would leave the circle of light and step back onto the path that led forward. They would carry the memories of the garden and the street with the silver cobblestones and the light in the window and the daughter running to meet her father. They would carry the feeling of the cup passed from hand to hand and the bread broken and shared. These things would not make the path any shorter or any easier. They would simply make it possible to keep walking, one step after another, for the sake of the homes and the people they had left behind and for the sake of the small kindnesses they had found along the way. The fire would burn down to embers, and the smoke would rise one last time before the wind carried it away. But the strength drawn from the stories and the sharing would remain, quiet and steady, in the hearts of those who had paused there. It would travel with them as they moved through the smoke and the memory, toward whatever waited at the end of the path. The land around them held its own quiet watch, and the night received them without judgment. In the space between one fire and the next, the ordinary courage of continuing and the ordinary grace of sharing continued to walk side by side, gentle and unassuming, like the smoke that rose and disappeared but left its warmth behind. In the soft light that rose with the dawn, the first soldiers stepped through the broken gates of the city, and a woman who had been hiding in the shadows reached out with trembling hands to touch the sleeve of the nearest one, her eyes filling with tears that spoke of a hope she had almost forgotten how to name. The morning air was cool and carried the faint scent of earth and leaves that had found their way into the spaces between ruined walls. Light fell gently across the streets, touching the edges of broken stone and the faces of those who moved through them. Soldiers walked slowly, their steps careful as if they were entering a place that needed quiet rather than noise. They did not call out or raise their voices. They simply moved forward, their eyes taking in the city that had waited for this morning in its own way. From doorways and cellars and the shadowed places behind fallen beams, people began to emerge. Their movements were hesitant at first, as if the light itself might be something that could disappear again if they moved too quickly. The woman who had reached for the soldier's sleeve stood very still after her fingers touched the fabric. She had been in the dark for a long time, and the light felt new against her skin. Her hand stayed on his sleeve for a moment longer than she had intended, as if the touch itself was something she needed to make sure was real. The soldier looked down at her hand and then at her face. He did not pull away. Instead, he placed his own hand gently over hers, a steadying pressure that said without words that he was there and that he saw her. Her eyes filled with tears that spilled over slowly, tracing paths down cheeks that had known too much dust and too little water. She did not sob. The tears came quietly, like something that had been held back for so long it could only come out in this gentle way. The soldier's eyes were tired, but they held a kindness that matched the light falling across them both. Nearby, an older man stepped from behind a broken wall. He walked with a slight limp, one hand resting against the stone for balance. When he saw the soldiers, he stopped and simply stood, his face open in a way that seemed to surprise even him. A young soldier nearby noticed and moved toward him without hurry. He offered his arm, not as someone giving orders but as someone offering balance. The older man took it, his grip light at first and then firmer as he found his footing on the uneven ground. They stood together for a moment, the older man's eyes moving across the street as if he were seeing it for the first time in a long while. He spoke in a low voice, words that were more breath than sound, something about the way the light used to fall on this corner before everything changed. The young soldier listened without interrupting, his presence steady and unhurried. The woman who had touched the first soldier's sleeve now wiped her eyes with the back of her free hand. She still held the fabric of his uniform lightly, as if letting go might mean the moment would fade. She thought of a letter she had once written and hidden, words meant for a brother who had gone away and never returned. The letter had never been sent, but she had kept it close, the paper growing soft from being unfolded and refolded in the dark. Now, standing in the dawn light with this soldier's sleeve under her fingers, she felt something similar to the feeling she had when she wrote those words, the quiet need to reach toward someone and say that she was still here. The soldier seemed to understand without being told. He stayed where he was, his hand still covering hers, his eyes meeting hers with a patience that asked nothing in return. Further along the street, a small group of people emerged from a cellar. They moved slowly, helping one another up the broken steps. A child held tightly to an older woman's hand, her eyes wide but not frightened. When they reached the street, a soldier who had been standing nearby stepped forward and offered the child a small piece of bread he had been carrying. He did it without ceremony, simply holding it out in his open palm. The older woman looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once and guided the child's hand to take it. The child took the bread and held it carefully, as if it were something fragile. She did not eat it right away. She simply held it and looked up at the soldier, her small face serious in the soft light. The soldier smiled, a small, tired smile that reached his eyes, and then he stepped back to give them space. The older woman touched his arm briefly in passing, a light pressure that said thank you without needing words. The first soldier and the woman who had reached for him began to walk slowly together. She still held his sleeve, and he matched his steps to hers so she would not have to hurry. They passed others who were emerging from hiding places, and each meeting was its own small story. A man who had been in the shadows stepped forward and embraced another soldier, their arms going around each other in a way that spoke of relief too deep for words. Their embrace was not loud. It was the kind of holding that happens when two people have both been waiting for something they were not sure would come. When they stepped apart, their eyes were wet, and they stood for a moment simply looking at each other before moving on. Another woman came forward with a cup of water she had somehow kept safe. She offered it to a soldier who looked as though he had not rested in a long time. He took it with both hands, drank slowly, and then returned the cup with a nod that carried more gratitude than any words could have held. The woman who walked beside the first soldier thought of her hidden letter again. She wondered if she would ever be able to write another one that could actually be sent, one that would say that the light had returned and that she had reached out and been met with a steady hand. The thought was not urgent. It simply lived alongside the feeling of the soldier's sleeve under her fingers and the sound of their footsteps on the broken street. The city around them was waking in its own quiet way. People moved through the streets with the same careful steps the soldiers used, as if everyone understood that this morning asked for gentleness rather than haste. Small kindnesses appeared without being planned. Someone offered a blanket to a soldier who had sat down to rest against the wall. Another person shared a piece of fruit they had saved, breaking it into small portions and passing them around without being asked. These acts were ordinary, yet they carried the weight of everything that had come before and everything that might come after. The soldier who walked with the woman thought of his own home, of the faces he carried in his memory and the letters he had received and read by a low light. He thought of how those letters had described ordinary days, light through a window, the sound of voices in another room, the simple fact of being together. Now, walking through this city at dawn with this woman's hand on his sleeve, he felt something similar to the feeling those letters had given him. It was the feeling of connection, of being seen and of seeing someone else in return. The exhaustion that had been in his body for so long did not disappear, but it felt different when shared with someone who was also finding her way back to hope. They continued walking, their steps slow and matched, the light growing a little stronger around them. In other parts of the city, similar meetings unfolded. A man who had been hiding in a basement emerged and found his neighbor, and the two of them stood together for a long time without speaking, their hands clasped as if to make sure neither one would disappear again. A young girl who had been alone for too long was taken gently by the hand by an older woman who had also been waiting, and together they walked toward a place where others were gathering in the soft light. Soldiers moved among them, offering what they could, water, a steady arm, a quiet presence that asked nothing in return. These moments were not marked by celebration. They were marked by the simple, profound relief of being able to reach out and be met with kindness instead of fear. The woman who had first touched the soldier's sleeve finally let go, though she stayed close beside him as they walked. She wiped her eyes again and looked around at the city that was slowly coming back to itself in the dawn light. She thought of the letters she had hidden and of the words she had written in the dark. She thought of how those words had been a way of holding on to hope when hope had been hard to find. Now, with the light falling across the broken streets and with this soldier's steady presence beside her, she felt the beginning of something she had almost forgotten how to name. It was not a loud feeling. It was quiet, like the light itself, and it lived in the space between one careful step and the next. In the spirit of those quiet embraces at the gates of Minsk, perhaps you might find comfort in a carefully chosen piece of World War II memorabilia or the moving film Midway on Amazon Prime, which honors the personal courage found in every theater of that great conflict. It is a gentle way to hold close the stories of ordinary people who endured extraordinary times. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The dawn continued to open over the city. The light grew a little stronger, touching more faces and more broken stones, but it never lost its softness. People and soldiers moved through the streets together, their steps slow and their voices low when they spoke at all. The embraces and the offerings of water and bread and steady arms continued in small, unhurried ways. Each one was its own beginning, the beginning of remembering how to hope, the beginning of trusting that a hand reached out would be met rather than turned away, the beginning of a city and its people finding their way back to the simple, ordinary acts of living that had been waiting for them all along. The woman who had first reached out walked a little taller now, though her steps were still careful. The soldier beside her matched her pace without being asked. Together they moved through the soft light, part of the quiet gathering of people who were learning, one gentle moment at a time, that hope could be held again in trembling hands and offered in steady ones. The city received them all without hurry. The light continued to rise. And in the space between the broken gates and the open streets, the slow, profound work of remembering how to hope went on, carried forward by every quiet embrace, every shared cup of water, and every careful step taken together in the gentle dawn. In the long light of late afternoon, men walked the road that led west, their steps slow and uneven, former officers and young recruits moving side by side with nothing left between them but the shared silence and the small kindnesses that kept the road from swallowing them whole. The road stretched ahead in a pale ribbon, dust rising softly with each footfall and settling again behind them. Trees lined parts of it, their branches offering occasional shade, while open fields lay on either side, the grass bending in the low wind. The men moved in a loose group, some with coats slung over shoulders, others with packs that had grown lighter with each day. Ranks no longer mattered here. A man who had once given orders now walked with the same tired gait as the youngest among them. Their uniforms were faded and torn in places, but the differences that had once seemed important had worn away with the miles. What remained was the simple fact of walking together, one step after another, toward whatever waited at the end of the road. A young man near the front of the group carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He had found it earlier in the day and had not opened it, though hunger sat low in his stomach. When they paused for a short rest beside a stand of trees, he unwrapped the bundle carefully and broke the bread inside into uneven pieces. He handed the largest to an older man who walked with a slight limp, then passed the rest around without looking at anyone directly. The older man took his piece and nodded once, a small gesture that carried more thanks than words could have held. He broke his own portion again and gave half back to the young man, who accepted it with quiet surprise. They ate slowly, the bread tasting of dust and the long day, but the sharing made it enough for the moment. The older man had once worn insignia that marked him as someone who gave commands. Now those marks were gone, and he walked with the same dust on his boots as everyone else. He thought of a letter he had written weeks earlier, one he had folded and kept in his coat until the paper had grown soft from handling. In it he had tried to describe the trees near his home and the way the light fell across the garden in the evening. He had not sent it. There had been no address that felt safe anymore, and the words had seemed too small for the distance that had grown between him and the life he had left. Now, sitting under the trees with the young man beside him, he thought of that letter again. He wished he had written more about ordinary things, the sound of rain on the roof, the way his wife would hum while she worked, so that something of home could travel with him on this road. The young man beside him had never given orders. He had joined when the call came and had walked wherever he was told to walk. His private fears lived in the quiet spaces between steps, the fear that the road would never end, the fear that he would forget the faces he carried in his memory, the fear that whatever waited at the end would ask more of him than he had left to give. He did not speak of these fears. Instead, he offered the bread and accepted the half that was returned to him. In that small exchange he found a moment of steadiness. The older man's presence, the shared food, the simple nod, these things did not erase the tiredness or the uncertainty, but they made the road feel less endless for a little while. They rose after the short rest and continued walking. The group moved without formation now, some ahead and some behind, but always within sight of one another. When one man stumbled on a loose stone, another reached out without being asked and steadied him by the elbow. The touch was brief, a light pressure that said he was not alone on the uneven ground. The man who had stumbled nodded his thanks and kept walking, his steps a little surer after the small kindness. These gestures happened again and again along the road. A coat was shared when the wind grew cooler. A canteen was passed when someone's voice grew hoarse from the dust. A story was told in a low voice when the silence grew too heavy, a story about a dog that had followed a boy through the fields, or about the way bread tasted when it was still warm from the oven. The stories were ordinary, but they carried the weight of everything the men had left behind and everything they hoped might still be waiting. The older man thought of his home again as they walked. He remembered the garden and the light through the window and the letter he had never sent. He thought of his wife's hands, strong from years of work, and the way they had felt the last time he held them. The memory was gentle rather than sharp. It did not stop his feet from moving, but it gave his steps a quieter rhythm, as if he were walking toward something rather than only away from what had been lost. The young man beside him carried his own memories. He thought of his mother's voice calling him in from the yard when evening came, and of the way she would leave a light in the kitchen even when she knew he would be late. These images lived alongside the dust on the road and the ache in his legs. They did not make the walking easier, but they made it possible to keep placing one foot in front of the other. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, the group found a place where the road curved beside a small stream. They stopped again, some kneeling to drink, others sitting on the grass with their backs against trees. The older man and the young man sat together once more. The young man took off his boots and rubbed his feet, wincing at the blisters that had formed. Without being asked, the older man reached into his pack and brought out a small strip of cloth he had been saving. He tore it into pieces and handed them over. The young man looked at the cloth for a moment, then at the older man's face. He accepted it with a quiet thank you that was barely more than a breath. Together they wrapped the worst of the blisters, their hands working slowly in the fading light. The act was practical, but it carried something more, the recognition that they were still capable of caring for one another even when everything else felt uncertain. They stayed by the stream until the light had almost gone. Someone built a small fire from dry branches, and the group gathered around it without being told. The flames were low, just enough to push back the immediate darkness. The older man spoke again, his voice carrying the same steady tone he had used earlier. He told of a winter evening when snow had covered the garden and the family had sat together by the stove, sharing stories to keep the cold from settling too deeply into the room. The young man listened, and when the story ended he offered one of his own, a memory of running through fields with his brother, their laughter rising into the summer air. These stories were not about the road or the walking. They were about the lives that had existed before the road and the hope that those lives might still exist somewhere ahead. The sharing did not take away the private fears that each man carried, but it placed those fears in a larger space where they did not have to be faced alone. When the fire burned low, they settled into what rest they could find. Some lay close to the embers with their coats pulled around them. Others sat with their backs against trees, their eyes half closed but not fully asleep. The older man and the young man stayed near each other. The young man thought of the letter he wished he could write, words that would say he was still walking, still sharing bread and cloth and stories, still finding small reasons to place one foot in front of the other. He knew the letter might never be written or sent, but the thought itself felt like a small act of keeping himself intact. The older man seemed to carry a similar understanding. He rested with his hands folded over his chest, his breathing steady, his presence a quiet anchor for the young man beside him. The road waited ahead, long and uncertain, but the night offered this small space of shared warmth and shared silence. In the morning they would rise again and continue walking, former officers and young recruits side by side, their steps slow but steady. They would carry the memory of the bread broken and shared, the cloth given without being asked, the stories told in low voices around the dying fire. These things would not change the length of the road or the weight of what waited at its end. They would simply make the walking possible, one reluctant but continued step at a time. The kindnesses were small, but they were enough to keep despair from settling too deeply into any single heart. They were the everyday ways men who had once been divided by rank and duty found a way to remain human on a road that asked everything of them and offered little in return. Just as these men found unexpected grace on the long road west, our Gumroad collection offers a rare digital treasury of uncensored wartime photographs and raw personal accounts from the Eastern Front, material too stark and real for open platforms. It lets you witness the unvarnished human side that history often softens. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The night continued its slow turning around the small fire and the men who rested beside it. The road stretched ahead into darkness, but the small circle of light and the small acts of sharing held the group together for a little while longer. In the morning the walking would resume, the dust would rise again with each step, and the long road would continue its patient demand for endurance. Yet the men who walked it would carry something more than dust and tiredness. They would carry the memory of a hand steadying an elbow, of bread broken and passed without ceremony, of stories told in voices that had learned to save their strength for what mattered. These memories would walk with them as surely as their feet carried them forward. They would become the quiet strength that kept despair at bay and allowed the road to be walked one day at a time, one shared kindness at a time, by men who had once been divided but who now moved together in the simple, profound recognition that they were all on the same long path, heading west under the same sky. In the green shadows where moonlight slipped through the leaves like quiet silver threads, a young woman's hand reached back to steady a tired soldier, her fingers light but sure on his arm as she guided him along a path only she could see. The forest breathed around them. Trees stood close, their branches forming a canopy that turned the night into a softer darkness. The ground underfoot was uneven but familiar to the guides who moved ahead. A young woman walked in front, her steps quiet and certain. She had grown up in these woods, learning the trails from her father and grandmother before the world had changed. Behind her came a teenage boy, barely old enough to carry the weight he bore, yet he moved with the same careful knowledge. Between and behind them walked soldiers whose exhaustion showed in the way their shoulders sagged and their feet dragged slightly on the soft earth. They had been moving for a long time, and the forest offered both shelter and uncertainty. The young woman did not speak much. When she did, her voice was low, almost a whisper, telling them where to place their feet or when to pause and listen to the night. The soldier whose arm she had steadied was older than most of the others. His breath came in low, even rhythms, but there was a heaviness in it that spoke of days without proper rest. He had followed her without question since they entered the trees, trusting the quiet confidence in her movements. When she reached back again a little later, this time offering a small sip from a flask she carried, he accepted it gratefully. The water was cool and tasted of the leaves it had passed through. He handed it back without taking more than his share, and she nodded once in the dim light. That small exchange carried more than thanks. It carried the beginning of something like brotherhood between people who had started the night as strangers. The teenage boy moved alongside another soldier, a younger man whose eyes kept drifting closed even as he walked. When the path grew narrow between two thick trunks, the boy reached out and touched the soldier's sleeve lightly, guiding him around a route that could have tripped him. The soldier blinked, coming back to the present, and offered a tired smile that the boy returned. They did not speak, but the touch and the smile were enough. In that moment the forest seemed to draw them closer, as if the green shadows themselves approved of the small kindness passing between them. The young woman paused at a place where the trees opened into a small clearing. Moonlight fell more fully here, touching the faces of those who gathered. She motioned for them to rest for a short while. The soldiers lowered themselves to the ground with quiet relief, some leaning against trees, others sitting with their backs to one another for support. The teenage boy moved among them with a small bundle of dried fruit he had been carrying. He offered pieces without being asked, his hand steady even though his own tiredness showed in the way he moved more slowly now. One of the soldiers accepted a piece and then broke it in half, giving part back to the boy. The boy looked surprised for a moment, then accepted it with a nod that mirrored the young woman's earlier gesture. These small acts of sharing happened without fanfare. They were simply the way people kept one another moving when the night felt long and the path uncertain. The older soldier who had taken water earlier sat with his back against a broad trunk. He watched the young woman as she moved quietly around the edge of the clearing, checking the ground with her hands before allowing anyone to settle. She seemed to know where the earth was firm and where it might give way. When she came near him again, he spoke in a low voice, asking her how she had learned the path so well. She answered simply, telling him of afternoons spent following her grandmother through these same trees, learning which plants could be eaten and which trails stayed dry even after heavy rain. Her words were not many, but they carried the weight of a lifetime lived close to the land. The soldier listened, and something in his face softened. He thought of his own home, of the fields he had walked as a boy, and of a letter he had once written to his sister describing the way the wheat moved in the wind. He had not been able to send that letter, but the memory of writing it lived with him still. Now, listening to the young woman speak of her forest, he felt a quiet connection to the place and to the people who knew it so deeply. The teenage boy sat near the younger soldier he had guided earlier. They shared the last of the dried fruit in silence for a while. Then the boy spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, telling a small story about a fox he had once followed through these woods when he was even younger. The fox had led him to a patch of berries his family had later gathered. The soldier smiled in the dim light and offered a story of his own, a memory of fishing with his father on a river that ran slow and clear in the summer. These stories were ordinary, yet they wove something gentle between the two. They reminded both that even in the middle of this long night, there were still memories of simpler times to carry. The stories did not erase the private fears each carried, the fear of what might lie ahead in the darkness, the fear of losing the way, the fear of the unknown that waited beyond the forest. But the sharing made those fears feel less sharp, less alone. After a short rest, the young woman rose and motioned for them to continue. The group moved again, single file along a narrow trail that wound between the trees. The young woman led, her steps sure even when the moonlight faded under thicker branches. The teenage boy stayed near the middle, ready to reach out if anyone stumbled. The soldiers followed, their exhaustion still present but eased by the small rests and the quiet presence of the guides. When the path grew steep for a short stretch, the older soldier felt a hand on his arm again, the young woman's, steady and unhurried. She did not pull or hurry him. She simply offered balance until the ground leveled again. He thanked her in a low voice, and she answered with the same small nod she had given earlier. In that repeated gesture lived a quiet determination that did not need to announce itself. It simply continued, guiding strangers through the night as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They walked for a long time in this way. The forest changed around them. Sometimes the trees grew closer, sometimes they opened into small clearings where moonlight could reach the ground. The night sounds were soft, the rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a night bird, the low breathing of the people moving together. At one point the group paused again when the young woman raised her hand. They stood still, listening. Somewhere ahead there was a sound that did not belong to the forest. The young woman listened for a long moment, then motioned for them to follow a different path that curved away from the noise. She led them without hurry, her steps never losing their certainty. The soldiers followed, trusting the way she moved through the shadows. When they were safely past the place, she allowed another short rest. The teenage boy offered water this time, passing a small container from one person to the next. Each took only what they needed. The sharing was quiet and even, another small thread binding them together. The older soldier thought again of his home and of the letter he had written. He thought of how his sister might be sitting at her table now, perhaps looking out at fields that had once been his as well. The thought brought a gentle ache, but it also brought a kind of strength. He was still walking. He was still being guided by people who knew the land. He was still part of a small circle of strangers, becoming something more through the simple acts of steadying hands and shared water and low-voiced stories. The young woman leading them seemed to carry a similar understanding. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had chosen this path not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Her determination was not loud. It lived in the way she checked each step before allowing others to follow, in the way she offered water or balance without being asked, and the way she kept moving even when her own tiredness must have been great. As the night deepened, they finally reached a place where the trees thinned and the path opened onto a wider trail. The young woman stopped and turned to face the group. In the dim light her face was calm, her eyes steady. She told them in her low voice that from here the way was clearer, that they could continue on their own if they wished, or rest a little longer before moving on. The older soldier stepped forward and offered her his hand. She took it, and for a moment they stood like that, two people who had started the night as strangers and who now shared the quiet bond of having walked through the green shadows together. The teenage boy stood nearby, and the younger soldier he had guided placed a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that needed no words. These small moments of connection had turned the long night into something more than a passage through danger. They had turned it into a shared experience of trust and kindness. The group rested a little longer in the thinner trees. Some sat on the ground, others leaned against trunks. The young woman and the teenage boy moved among them one last time, making sure everyone had what they needed for the next part of their journey. When it was time to part, there were no grand words. There were only quiet nods and the memory of hands that had reached out in the darkness. The soldiers continued along the wider path, their steps a little lighter than they had been when the night began. The young woman and the teenage boy watched them go for a moment, then turned back into the green shadows, their own path leading elsewhere but their determination unchanged. The forest received them all without judgment. The trees stood as they always had, offering shelter to those who knew how to move through them with care. The young woman walked with the same steady steps she had used all night, the teenage boy beside her. They did not speak much. There was no need. The night had already said what mattered, that strangers could become brothers through the simple acts of guiding and being guided, of sharing water and stories and steady hands in the dark. The quiet determination that had carried them through the green shadows would carry them forward into whatever came next. It asked for no recognition. It simply continued, one careful step after another, rooted in the love of the land and the belief that even in the longest nights, people could still find their way by helping one another along the hidden trails. The quiet determination of those who knew every hidden trail reminds us how much dedication goes into preserving truth. If this story has moved you, a small tip on Ko-Fi, even a single $1, helps sustain the countless hours of research and care that go into bringing these forgotten human moments back to light for everyone who needs them. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The green shadows eventually gave way to the thinner trees and the wider path. The young woman and the teenage boy disappeared back into the forest they knew so well, their footsteps quiet on the soft earth. The soldiers continued their journey under the same sky, carrying with them the memory of hands that had reached out in the darkness and voices that had spoken low and steady when words were needed. The night had been long, but it had not been walked alone. In the space between one hidden trail and the next, the simple, profound truth had been lived out again, that when people move through uncertainty together, guided by those who know the way and sustained by small kindnesses offered without expectation, even the longest nights can become passages of connection rather than isolation. The forest stood watch as it always had. The moonlight continued to slip through the leaves in silver threads. And the quiet determination of those who guided and those who followed remained, gentle and enduring, a light that needed no announcement to be felt by anyone who had walked even a little way in the green shadows. In the quiet shade of a birch tree whose bark was pale as moonlight, a weary soldier sat with a letter in his hands, the paper soft from its long journey and the familiar handwriting already reaching toward him like a voice he had almost forgotten how to hear. He had been walking for days, or perhaps it only felt that way because the tiredness had settled deep into his bones. The advance had carried him and the others through forests and fields, across ground that sometimes gave way and sometimes held firm. Now, in a brief pause while others rested nearby, he leaned against the smooth trunk of the birch and let his eyes close for a moment. The air was cool under the leaves, and the light that filtered through was soft and dappled. When a comrade quietly placed the letter in his lap without speaking, the soldier opened his eyes and looked down at it as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. The envelope was creased and smudged, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was the same careful script that had written to him before, the same loops and lines that belonged to home. He held the envelope for a little while without opening it. His fingers traced the edges, feeling the slight thickness where the paper had been folded many times. Around him, other soldiers rested in small groups or alone. Some sat with their backs to trees like him, their eyes half closed. Others spoke in low voices, sharing water or a piece of bread. No one disturbed him. They seemed to understand without being told that this moment belonged to him and to whatever waited inside the envelope. One young soldier nearby glanced over once, then looked away again, giving him the quiet space that felt like its own kind of kindness. The weary soldier took a slow breath and carefully opened the envelope. The paper inside was thin and had traveled far, but the words were still clear. He began to read slowly, his eyes moving across the lines as if he were walking through a familiar garden. The letter spoke of ordinary things, the way the light fell across the kitchen table in the late afternoon, the sound of rain on the roof the night before, the small repairs his father had made to the fence that had been leaning for too long. There were no grand declarations, only the steady details of a life that continued even when he was far away. As he read, something inside his chest loosened. The weariness did not vanish, but it felt less heavy for a little while. The familiar handwriting wrapped around him like a gentle hand, guiding him back to a place where he was known not as a soldier on a long advance, but simply as a son, a brother, someone who belonged to a kitchen table and a leaning fence and the sound of rain on a roof. He read the letter twice, then folded it carefully along the same creases it had carried all this way. He did not put it back into the envelope right away. Instead, he held it against his chest for a moment, feeling the paper warm slightly from his hand. Around him the others continued their quiet rest. The young soldier who had glanced over earlier now sat a little closer, not speaking but offering his presence like a steady presence beside a fire. Another man passed a small cup of water without being asked, setting it on the ground near the weary soldier's hand. These small kindnesses were not loud. They were the everyday ways people reminded one another that even in the middle of a long advance, they were still connected by more than orders or the ground beneath their feet. The weary soldier thought of his family as he sat with the letter against his chest. He pictured his mother at the kitchen table, perhaps writing this very letter by the same light she had described. He thought of his father working on the fence, his hands moving with the patient care that had always been part of their home. He thought of the small details that made a life feel whole, the smell of bread baking, the way the cat would curl in the sunniest patch of floor, the sound of voices in the next room. These images lived inside him alongside the tiredness and the private fears that came with every day of moving forward. The fears were there, the fear that the advance would ask more than he had left to give, the fear that the faces he carried in his memory might change before he could see them again, the fear of the unknown that waited beyond the next forest or field. Yet the letter had brought something gentle to stand beside those fears. It had brought the reminder that he was still loved, still remembered, still part of a world that continued in small, ordinary ways even when he could not be there to see it. He took a sip from the cup of water that had been left for him. The coolness helped clear the dust from his throat. He looked over at the young soldier sitting nearby and offered a small nod of thanks. The young soldier nodded back, and for a moment their eyes met in the dappled light under the birch. No words were needed. The shared glance was enough to say that they were both carrying letters inside them, whether written on paper or held only in memory. The weary soldier thought of how many such letters must be traveling across the land at this very moment, words folded and carried by hands that could not always deliver them quickly, yet still arriving when they were needed most. The thought connected him to something larger than his own tiredness. It connected him to the quiet network of people who wrote and read and waited, each small act of putting pen to paper or unfolding a letter becoming its own form of everyday courage. He read the letter once more, this time more slowly, letting each line settle into him like water finding its way into dry earth. The words about the kitchen table and the leaning fence and the rain on the roof felt like anchors. They reminded him that there was still a place where the light fell in a certain way and where people moved through their days with the same patient care his father showed the fence. That place was far away, but the letter had brought a piece of it to him under this birch tree. He folded the paper again, this time more carefully than before, and slipped it back into the envelope. He placed the envelope inside his coat, close to his heart, where it would stay safe during the next part of the advance. The weight of it against his chest was not a burden. It was a quiet strength he could carry forward. Around him the others began to stir as the pause came to an end. Someone stood and stretched, another gathered a small pack. The young soldier who had sat nearby offered his hand to help the weary one to his feet. The weary soldier took it, his legs stiff from resting but his heart a little lighter than it had been before the letter arrived. They moved together toward the others, the group preparing to continue along the path that led forward. The birch tree stood behind them, its pale bark catching the light one last time before they stepped out from under its shade. The weary soldier touched the place where the letter rested inside his coat, a small gesture that no one else noticed but that steadied him for the steps ahead. He thought of the words he might write in return when there was time and when paper could be found. He would tell them about the birch tree and the way the light fell through its leaves. He would describe the small kindnesses of comrades who shared water and space and silent presence. He would not write of the tiredness or the private fears, because those things were already known in the spaces between the lines his family had sent. Instead, he would write of the letter finding him, of the familiar handwriting wrapping around his heart, of the gentle hand that had reached across the distance to guide him for a little while. That letter would travel back along the same uncertain paths, carried by hands that understood how much a few ordinary words could mean when everything else felt uncertain. The group moved forward again, their steps resuming the rhythm of the advance. The weary soldier walked among them, the letter close to his heart and the memory of the birch tree's shade still fresh in his mind. The road ahead was long, and the days would continue to ask much of them all. Yet in the quiet space under the tree, something had been restored, a small piece of himself that the advance had worn thin. The familiar handwriting had reminded him that he was more than the miles he had walked or the ground he had crossed. He was still the person who belonged to a kitchen table and a leaning fence and the sound of rain on a roof. That belonging traveled with him now, folded inside an envelope and held close, a quiet light that no amount of dust or tiredness could entirely dim. The others walked beside him, their own small kindnesses and shared silences forming the gentle web that held them all together as they moved forward, one step after another, carrying whatever letters or memories sustained them through the long days and the uncertain nights. For those who wish to go deeper into these hidden networks of courage, our Patreon community offers free podcasts, extended raw video segments without blurring, and a warm circle of fellow history lovers who believe, like you, that remembering the personal side of history heals us all. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The path continued to unfold ahead of them, the birch tree falling behind as they walked. The weary soldier kept his hand near his coat from time to time, feeling the faint shape of the envelope beneath the fabric. It was a small reassurance in the middle of a large movement, a reminder that even when the advance carried them far from the places they loved, those places could still reach them through careful words written on thin paper. The others around him carried their own unseen bundles, memories, hopes, the quiet strength that came from knowing someone, somewhere, was thinking of them. These unseen things traveled alongside the visible steps they took, sustaining them in ways that could not be measured in miles or days. The land around them continued its own slow turning, the trees and fields and skies holding space for all the small human stories unfolding within them. And in the gentle rhythm of walking together, with letters folded close and kindnesses offered without expectation, the weary soldier and those who walked beside him found the quiet courage to keep moving forward, one careful step after another, guided by the gentle hands of words that had traveled far to find them. In the low glow of lanterns hung from old beams, hands moved gently through the night, tending wounds and quieting fears in a place where the walls had once held lessons and now held only the steady work of mending what had been broken. The barn was large and quiet except for the soft sounds of breathing and the occasional low murmur of a voice offering comfort. Lantern light fell in warm pools across rows of straw-filled pallets where men lay resting or stirring in uneasy sleep. The air carried the mingled scents of hay, earth, and the clean sharpness of water that had been carried from a nearby stream. Outside, the night was still, but inside the old walls a different kind of stillness held sway, the stillness of people working with care because care was what remained to give. A woman moved slowly between the pallets, her steps unhurried even though her eyes showed the tiredness of many hours without rest. She carried a basin of water and clean cloths folded over her arm. When she knelt beside a young man whose face was tight with pain, she spoke in a voice so low it blended with the rustle of the straw. She told him the water would be cool and that she would be gentle. Her hands, steady from long practice, cleaned and wrapped with the same attention she might have given to mending a torn sleeve or soothing a frightened child. The young man's breathing eased a little as she worked. When she finished, she placed a folded cloth under his head to make the straw softer and left a small cup of water within reach of his hand. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, yet in that moment there was a flicker of something like gratitude. She met his gaze and nodded once, a small acknowledgement that needed no words. Nearby, another figure moved among the wounded. An older man with kind eyes and hands that had known both soil and suffering knelt beside someone whose uniform was different from most of the others in the barn. The wounded man's breathing was shallow, and his face was pale in the lantern light. The older man spoke quietly, telling him that he was not alone and that the night would pass. He offered water in the same careful way the woman had done, holding the cup so the man could drink without straining. When the wounded man's hand trembled, the older man steadied it with his own, the touch light but present until the cup was empty. Then he adjusted the blanket that had slipped and sat for a moment longer, his presence a quiet anchor in the dim space. The wounded man's eyes closed after a while, some of the tightness leaving his face. The older man rose and moved to the next pallet, carrying the same gentle attention with him. In another corner, a young orderly sat with a man who could not sleep. The orderly's voice was soft as he spoke of small, ordinary things, the way the moon had looked earlier that evening, the sound of crickets in the grass outside, the memory of bread still warm from an oven. He did not ask questions or offer promises. He simply stayed, his words a low thread that kept the darkness from feeling too complete. The man listening eventually closed his eyes, his breathing slowing into something closer to rest. The orderly remained a little longer, then rose quietly and moved to help another who needed water or a change of position. These small acts repeated through the night like the steady rhythm of breathing itself. The woman who had first moved with the basin returned to a pallet where two men lay close enough to hear each other. One had been tended earlier, the other had only just arrived. She brought fresh water and clean cloths for both. When she finished with the first, she turned to the second without hesitation, her hands performing the same careful work. There was no pause between them, no distinction in the way she touched or spoke. The care flowed the same way the lantern light did, falling where it was needed without asking who lay beneath it. One of the men, the one who had arrived later, reached out weakly when she finished and touched her sleeve. His fingers were rough from the road, yet the touch was light, almost hesitant. She covered his hand with her own for a moment, then placed it gently back on the blanket. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of everything the night was trying to mend. Across the barn, an older orderly helped a younger wounded man sit up enough to drink. The younger man's arm was bound, and the movement caused him pain, yet he did not cry out. Instead, he thanked the orderly in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. The orderly smiled in the low light and told him there was no need for thanks, that this was simply what hands did when they found someone who needed them. He stayed until the man was settled again, then moved on to the next pallet, his steps as steady as they had been at the beginning of the night. The tiredness showed in the way his shoulders curved, but it did not slow the gentleness of his touch or the softness of his voice when he spoke to those who stirred. In the quiet spaces between these moments, other small kindnesses unfolded. A man who could sit up a little offered his cup of water to another who could not reach his own. The exchange happened without anyone asking. It was simply one hand passing something needed to another hand that could not yet manage alone. Nearby, someone hummed a low tune under his breath, the melody so soft it blended with the rustle of straw and the occasional sigh of someone shifting in uneasy sleep. The humming was not for an audience. It was for the night itself, a small offering of sound to fill the spaces where silence might have grown too heavy. The woman with the basin moved to a pallet where a man lay with his eyes open, staring at the beams above. She knelt and spoke to him as she had spoken to the others, telling him what she was going to do before she did it. Her voice remained low and even, a steady thread in the dim light. As she worked, she noticed his hand clenching the edge of the blanket. Without pausing in her task, she reached over and placed her free hand lightly over his. The touch was warm and present. After a moment, his fingers loosened their grip. She finished what she had come to do and left the hand there a little longer, a quiet presence until his breathing eased. When she finally rose, she adjusted his blanket one last time and moved on, carrying the same gentle attention to the next person who needed it. Throughout the long hours, the barn held its own kind of healing. It was not loud or dramatic. It lived in the low voices that offered comfort without promises, and the hands that cleaned and wrapped and steadied without hesitation, and the small exchanges of water and blankets and presents that happened without being asked for. The people who moved among the pallets, women and men whose own tiredness was visible in their eyes, continued because stopping was not something they considered. The wounded who lay on the straw endured because endurance was what the night asked of them, and because they were not enduring alone. The hands that tended them belonged to people who had also walked long roads and carried their own private fears, yet those hands still reached out with the same care for every face they found in the lantern light. As the night deepened, the sounds in the barn grew even softer. Some of the wounded slept at last, their breathing steady in the warm pools of light. Others lay awake but calmer, the worst of the pain eased by the steady presence of those who moved among them. The woman with the basin paused for a moment near the door, looking back over the rows of pallets. Her shoulders were heavy, but her eyes held a quiet steadiness. She turned and continued her slow circuit, the basin refilled from a larger container near the wall, the cloths folded fresh over her arm. The work was endless and ordinary, yet in its repetition lived the proof that care could still move through a place where so much had been broken. Before we continue, I warmly invite you to join our free weekly email newsletter. As a thank you, you will receive the beautiful ebook The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, filled with forgotten tales of courage and hidden heroes that echo the gentle hands that healed without regard to uniform. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The lanterns continued to burn low as the hours passed. Outside, the night remained still, holding the barn in its quiet embrace. Inside, the hands kept moving, cleaning, wrapping, steadying, offering water and presents and low voices that asked nothing in return. The wounded who could rested. Those who could not still found moments of relief in the touch of a hand or the sound of a voice that did not hurry. In this old place that had once held lessons of a different kind of teaching unfolded through the simple, persistent acts of care. Bodies mended where they could. Spirits found small anchors in the gentleness that moved among them without distinction. The night asked much of everyone inside the walls, yet it also gave back the quiet proof that even in the aftermath of long roads and uncertain days, hands could still reach out and find each other, offering what they had left to give. The straw rustled softly. The lanterns glowed steadily. And the work of healing continued, one gentle touch at a time, proving again that care knows no flag and that the human heart, when given the chance, will always choose to mend what it can. In the soft light of early morning, soldiers stepped across an invisible line into lands they had never walked before, and a woman standing in the doorway of a small house offered a piece of bread with hands that trembled only slightly, her eyes meeting theirs with a shy, uncertain smile that carried more welcome than fear. The road had brought them through forests that gradually thinned and fields that began to look different in subtle ways, the shape of the trees, the curve of the hills, the way the light fell across the earth. They moved in small groups now, their steps slower than they had been days earlier, yet still carrying them forward. The air felt cooler here, touched by a breeze that came from a direction they did not yet know by name. When the first houses appeared at the edge of a village, the soldiers paused without being told, their eyes taking in the quiet scene before them. Smoke rose gently from a chimney. A dog barked once and then fell silent. People stood in doorways or at the edges of gardens, watching with faces that held both caution and something else, something that looked, from a distance, like the beginning of relief. The woman in the doorway was older, her hair pulled back in a simple way, her apron dusted with flour from the morning's baking. She had watched the soldiers approach along the road, her heart beating faster than she would have admitted. When they came close enough that she could see the tiredness in their faces and the dust on their boots, she stepped forward without quite knowing why. In her hand she held a round loaf she had baked the evening before, the crust still firm and the smell of it warm even in the open air. She broke it into pieces with steady fingers and held one out to the nearest soldier. Her smile was small and shy, the kind that appears when someone chooses kindness even though the world has given many reasons not to. The soldier looked at the bread, then at her face, and something in his own expression softened. He took the piece with both hands, as if it were more than bread, and nodded once in a way that said thank you without needing the words. He broke the piece again and offered half to the man walking beside him. That man, younger and with eyes that had seen too much of the long road, accepted it and looked toward the woman. She stood a little straighter now, the first offering given and received. Another villager, a man with lines around his eyes that spoke of years working the land, came forward carrying a pitcher of water. He poured some into a cup and handed it to a soldier who looked as though he had not rested properly in many nights. The soldier drank slowly, the water cool against his throat, and when he finished he returned the cup with a quiet word that the villager understood even if the language was not the same. Around them, other small exchanges began to unfold. A child peeked from behind a doorway and was gently pulled back by an older sister, yet the child's eyes remained curious and unafraid. A woman carrying a basket of vegetables paused on the path and offered a handful to a soldier who had sat down to rest against a low wall. He took them with the same careful hands that had taken the bread, and for a moment their eyes met in a glance that held no demand, only the simple recognition of two people choosing to be gentle with each other. The first soldier who had received the bread sat for a little while on the low wall, the piece still in his hand. He thought of home, of the kitchen where bread was baked in the same way, with the same smell rising into the morning air. He thought of the letters he had carried and read under other trees, the words that had described ordinary days and ordinary kindnesses. This moment felt like one of those words made real, a small, ordinary kindness offered across a distance that had once seemed impossible to cross. He looked again at the woman who had given the bread. She had not moved far from her doorway, yet she watched the soldiers with an expression that had shifted from caution to something quieter and more open. When another soldier approached and offered her a small tin cup he had been carrying, she accepted it with the same shy smile and filled it from a bucket near her door. The exchange was simple, yet it carried the weight of everything the long road had asked of them all. Nearby, a small group of villagers and soldiers sat together on the grass at the edge of a garden. One of the villagers, a man whose hands showed years of work with soil and tools, spoke in a low voice about the way the fields had looked before the seasons had turned difficult. A soldier listened, nodding at the familiar rhythm of the words even if he could not understand every one. Another villager, a young woman with a child on her hip, offered a piece of cheese she had wrapped in cloth. The child watched the soldiers with wide eyes, then reached out a small hand toward one of them. The soldier, without thinking, reached back and let the child grasp his finger for a moment. The touch was light and brief, yet it left something warm in the space between them. The young woman smiled, not shyly this time but with a quiet gratitude that said more than any words could have managed. The soldiers did not stay long. The road still called them forward, and the new lands ahead waited with their own uncertainties. Yet when they rose to continue, the small kindnesses they had received traveled with them. The piece of bread, the cup of water, the shy smile, the touch of a child's hand, these things settled into their hearts like seeds that might one day grow into something larger. One of the soldiers, the one who had first taken the bread from the woman in the doorway, turned as they left the edge of the village and raised his hand in a small wave. The woman raised hers in return, the gesture simple and unhurried. It was the kind of wave that says safe journey without needing to speak the words aloud. Around her, other villagers stood watching the soldiers move on, their faces holding a mixture of relief and something that looked, in the soft morning light, like the beginning of hope. As the group continued along the road that led deeper into the new lands, they spoke little at first. The tiredness was still there, yet it felt different now, touched by the memory of bread broken and shared, of water offered without hesitation, of eyes that had met across the invisible line and found something human on the other side. One of the younger soldiers thought of a letter he had received weeks earlier, the one that had described the garden at home and the way the vegetables continued to grow even when the world felt uncertain. He thought of how that letter had steadied him then, and how the bread and the shy smile had steadied him now. The two things felt connected, as if the ordinary kindnesses of home and the ordinary kindnesses of strangers on a new road were part of the same quiet thread running through everything. They walked for a while in this gentler rhythm, the landscape unfolding around them in ways that were both unfamiliar and somehow welcoming. Fields gave way to more fields, trees stood in different patterns, yet the earth beneath their feet felt the same. When they paused again at the crest of a low hill, one of the soldiers took the remaining piece of bread from his pocket and broke it once more, offering shares to those walking closest to him. The sharing happened without ceremony, the same way the woman in the village had broken her loaf. In that repeated gesture lived the beginning of something the long road had been moving toward all along, a sense that even as they crossed into new lands, they carried with them the possibility of connection rather than only separation. The sun climbed higher, warming the road and the fields on either side. The soldiers continued forward, their steps carrying them toward horizons that had once been only names on maps. Behind them, the village settled back into its morning rhythm, the woman in the doorway returning to her work with the memory of the soldiers' tired faces and the small wave that had passed between them. Ahead, other villages waited with their own doorways and their own possibilities of bread offered and smiles exchanged. The road itself did not change, yet something in the way the soldiers walked it had shifted. The private fears they each carried, the fear of what new lands might ask of them, the fear of losing the small connections they had made, the fear of a future that remained uncertain, were still present. But alongside those fears walked the memory of a shy smile and a piece of bread, small anchors that made the unknown feel a little less vast. In the spirit of those shy smiles and offered bread, perhaps you might find comfort in a carefully chosen piece of World War II memorabilia or the moving film Midway on Amazon Prime, which honors the personal courage found in every theater of that great conflict. It is a gentle way to hold close the stories of ordinary people who endured extraordinary times. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. They walked on through the new lands, the road stretching ahead under the same sky that had watched them cross so many other roads before. The bread had been shared and eaten, the water had been drunk, the shy smiles had been offered and received. Yet the feeling of those moments remained, traveling with them like a quiet promise that even when borders were crossed and new horizons appeared, the simplest human gestures could still remind everyone involved that they were more than the lines drawn on maps or the long roads they had walked. A child's small hand reaching out, a cup of water poured without being asked, a piece of bread broken and passed from one tired traveler to another. These were the things that hinted at a future where the distance between people might one day grow smaller than the distance between one village and the next. The soldiers carried that hint forward with them, their steps steady on the road that led deeper into the unknown, their hearts holding the memory of a doorway and a smile and the simple, profound gift of being met with kindness when they had expected only distance. The land around them continued to unfold, field after field, tree after tree, and somewhere ahead other doorways waited with other loaves and other shy smiles, ready to offer what they could to travelers who had learned, one small exchange at a time, that shared humanity could travel farther than any map could show. In the soft light that touched the fields at the edge of morning, hands returned to the earth with simple tools, planting seeds into soil that still held the memory of what had passed, as if the ground itself needed reminding that life had not finished its story. The field stretched wide under a sky that had begun to clear after many days of low clouds. Here and there the earth rose in uneven places where the ground had been disturbed, small hollows and ridges that the rain had already begun to soften. A man walked slowly across one of these fields, a wooden plow balanced on his shoulder and a sack of seeds tied at his waist. His steps were careful, not because he feared the uneven ground, but because he moved with the patience of someone who had learned that haste had no place in this kind of work. Behind him came a younger woman, carrying a basket that held the few tools they still possessed, a hoe with a worn handle, a small rake, and a length of rope that had once tied a gate. They did not speak much as they walked. The morning was quiet, and the only sounds were the soft rustle of their footsteps and the occasional call of a bird returning to the trees at the field's edge. When they reached the place where they had decided to begin, the man set the plow down and knelt to touch the soil. It was cool and damp from the night, and it crumbled gently between his fingers. He worked a small section with his hands first, loosening the earth around one of the hollows until it lay flatter. The younger woman watched him for a moment, then knelt beside him and began to do the same a little farther along. Their hands moved in the same rhythm without needing to be told. This was work they had done together before, in other seasons, though the land had looked different then. Now there were places where nothing grew yet, and places where small green shoots had already pushed through despite everything. The man paused to look at one of these shoots, his face softening as he traced its thin stem with one finger. It had found its way up through the marked soil on its own, and that seemed to him like a promise he could trust. They began to plant. The man used the plow to turn narrow rows, and the woman followed with the seeds, dropping them carefully into the turned earth and covering them with her hands. The work was slow and steady. Every so often one of them would pause to rest their back or to drink from a small flask of water they had carried from the village. When the woman paused, the man would sometimes take the rake and smooth the row she had just planted, making sure the seeds were well covered. These small exchanges happened without words, yet they carried the quiet kindness that had sustained them through harder days. Once, when the woman's hand brushed against a sharp stone half buried in the soil, the man reached over and moved it aside before she could cut herself. She looked at him and gave a small nod, the kind that said thank you without needing to be spoken aloud. As the morning light grew stronger, other people appeared at the edges of nearby fields. An older woman walked slowly with a basket of what looked like young plants she had started in a sheltered place. She stopped at the edge of the field where the man and the woman worked and called out in a low voice. The man rose and went to meet her. She offered him a few of the young plants, explaining with simple gestures that they grew well even in difficult soil. He accepted them with both hands and carried them back to where the woman waited. Together they planted the new shoots in a small patch near the edge of the field, where the ground seemed a little kinder. The older woman stayed for a while, working alongside them without being asked. When the sun climbed higher, she shared a piece of bread she had wrapped in cloth, breaking it into 3 parts and handing one to each of them. They ate sitting on the ground, the bread tasting of the morning and of the shared work. The man thought of a letter he had once received from a brother who had gone away long before. The letter had spoken of fields in another place and of the way the soil there had felt after a hard season, still holding life even when it looked empty at first glance. He had kept that letter folded in his coat for many months, reading it when the days felt too long. Now, with his hands in the earth again, he remembered the words without needing to open the paper. The memory steadied him as he worked. The younger woman beside him carried her own quiet thoughts. She thought of the home she had returned to after many weeks away, of the way the walls still stood even though parts of the roof had fallen. She had spent the first days clearing what she could, then had come to the fields because the land needed tending if anyone was to eat when the seasons turned again. The work in the soil felt like the beginning of something larger than survival. It felt like a way of saying that the field still belonged to those who knew how to listen to them. They worked through the warmest part of the day with only short rests. When the sun grew too strong, they moved to the shade of a tree at the field's edge and drank more water. The older woman had gone back to her own plot, but she had left the remaining young plants with them, a gift that did not need to be repaid. The man and the woman sat in the shade and spoke a little then, about the way the soil felt in their hands and about the small green things that were already growing in unexpected places. The woman told a story about a bird she had seen that morning, building a nest in a tree that had lost many branches yet still stood tall enough to offer shelter. The man listened and smiled, the lines around his eyes softening. These small stories were like the seeds they planted, ordinary, yet carrying the hope that something new could still take root. In the afternoon they returned to the rows. The man used the plow again where the ground was hardest, and the woman followed with the seeds and the young plants. They worked side by side, sometimes only an arm's length apart, sometimes farther when one moved ahead to prepare the next section. When the woman grew tired, the man took the rake from her without being asked and finished the row she had started. When he paused to wipe his brow, she offered him the flask first. These quiet exchanges were the rhythm of their day, as steady as the turning of the earth beneath their tools. The fields around them slowly changed as other people returned to their own plots. Smoke rose from a chimney in the distance where someone had lit a fire to cook a simple meal. A child's voice called from the edge of another field, and an answering voice called back. The sounds were small and ordinary, yet they felt like the beginning of something that had been missing for a long time. As the light began to soften toward evening, the man and the woman finished the section they had set out to plant that day. They stood together at the edge of the rows and looked back at what they had done. The turned earth lay in neat lines now, the seeds and young plants hidden but safe beneath the soil. The craters and hollows were still there, softened by the day's work but not erased. The man knelt once more and touched the ground with his palm, as if to say that he would return tomorrow and the day after. The woman stood beside him, her hands resting on the handle of the rake. Neither of them spoke of what the fields had once been or what they might become. They simply stood in the quiet evening light, two people who had chosen to keep tending what they could. They gathered their tools and began to walk back toward the village as the first stars appeared. The basket felt lighter now, though they had used most of what it held. The man carried the plow across his shoulder again, and the woman walked beside him with the empty seed sack folded over her arm. Other people were returning from their own fields, some alone and some in small groups. A few called out greetings in low voices, and the man and woman answered in the same quiet way. When they reached the edge of the village, the older woman who had shared the young plants earlier waved from her doorway. The man raised a hand in return, and the woman beside him smiled the small, tired smile of someone who had done good work and knew it. Inside the small house where they stayed, the woman lit a single lamp and set water to warm over a low fire. The man sat at the table and unfolded a piece of cloth that held the last of the bread from the morning. They ate without hurry, the simple meal tasting of the day's labor and of the kindness that had been offered without expectation. After they had eaten, the woman took a small piece of paper from a shelf and smoothed it flat. It was not a letter, only a scrap she had saved because the handwriting on it reminded her of someone she had loved. She traced the lines with her finger for a moment, then folded it again and placed it back on the shelf. The man watched without speaking, understanding that some things were kept close not because they could be read again, but because they carried the memory of a hand that had once written them. They went to sleep early, the tiredness of the day settling into their bodies like the soil settling around the seeds they had planted. Outside, the fields lay quiet under the emerging stars. The craters and hollows remained, but so did the new rows and the small green shoots that had found their way upward on their own. The land remembered what had passed over it, yet it also received what was offered now, the turned earth, the hidden seeds, the patient hands that returned day after day with simple tools and quiet determination. In the morning the man and the woman would rise again and walk back to the fields. They would continue the work they had begun, one row at a time, because the fields still needed tending and because tending them was the way they chose to answer everything that had come before. Just as these farmers returned with simple tools to soil still marked by craters, our Gumroad collection offers a rare digital treasury of uncensored wartime photographs and raw personal accounts from the Eastern Front, material too stark and real for open platforms. It lets you witness the unvarnished human side that history often softens. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The night passed gently over the village and the fields beyond it. The man and the woman slept deeply, their bodies resting from the day's labor and their hearts carrying the quiet satisfaction of work that had meaning. When they woke in the morning, the light would once again touch the turned rows and the small green things pushing upward. They would gather their tools and walk back across the soft earth, ready to continue what they had started. The craters would still be there, softened a little more by another day of rain and another day of careful hands. The seeds would continue their hidden work beneath the soil. And the people who returned to the fields would keep choosing, day after day, to plant and tend and believe that life could still insist on continuing, even in ground that remembered everything it had endured. The simple tools would rest against the wall of the small house until morning, and the quiet resilience that had brought the farmers back to their land would rest with them, steady and unassuming, ready for whatever the next row might ask of them. In the quiet heart of the forests, where a single hand reached out to steady another in the green shadows, and visible ripples began to move outward, touching distant shores and reminding people who had never walked those paths that courage could travel farther than any map could show. The trees stood tall and patient, their branches holding the night close while below them ordinary people moved with the same quiet determination they had always carried. A young woman who knew every hidden trail guided tired soldiers through the darkness, her steps sure even when the moonlight barely reached the ground. She did not think of the larger world beyond the trees. She thought only of the next careful placement of her foot and of the man behind her who needed her hand to keep from stumbling. When they paused in a small clearing, she offered him water from a flask she had filled earlier that day. He drank slowly, then passed the flask back with a nod that said more than words could manage in the hush of the forest. In that simple exchange lived a small act of resilience that neither of them would ever fully measure. Far from those trees, across an ocean and many borders, a man sat at a kitchen table in the late evening light. He held a letter that had traveled a long and uncertain distance. The handwriting was familiar, the words written by a brother who had once walked those same forests. The letter spoke of small things, the way the leaves moved in the wind, the sound of water over stones, the quiet way people helped one another when the night felt long. It did not describe grand events or vast movements. It described the steady courage of ordinary hands doing what needed to be done. The man at the table read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside a book he kept near his chair. Later, when he spoke with neighbors who were also waiting for news from far away, he shared a few of the words. He spoke of the flask passed in the darkness and of the nod that had carried more comfort than any promise. Those listening sat a little straighter. The story from the distant forests had traveled across the water and settled into their own quiet evening, offering a small measure of strength they had not known they needed. In another place, where different trees grew and different fields stretched toward another horizon, a young soldier wrote his own letter by the light of a small lamp. He had heard stories carried by comrades who had come from other parts of the long front. The stories spoke of people in far forests who continued to plant and tend and guide even when the ground itself seemed uncertain. He wrote of these things to his mother, choosing simple words because the larger ones felt too heavy for the thin paper. He told her of the way the courage of strangers could reach across distance and give heart to those who fought on other shores. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed it inside his coat, close to his heart. He did not know when or if it would reach her, but the act of writing it had already done something inside him. It had connected his own quiet fears to the quiet resilience of people he would never meet. Back in the forests, the young woman who knew the trails continued her work. She moved through the green shadows with the teenage boy who had become her steady companion. Together they led another group of tired travelers along paths only they could see clearly. When one of the travelers stumbled on a root hidden by leaves, the boy reached out without being asked and steadied him. The traveler, an older man whose face showed the weight of many long days, looked at the boy with surprise that slowly turned into gratitude. He offered the boy a small piece of bread he had been saving. The boy accepted it and broke it in half, giving one piece back. They ate in silence as they walked, the simple sharing becoming another small ripple in the larger pattern of the night. The young woman watched this exchange from ahead and felt something loosen in her chest. The kindness between strangers in her forest was the same kindness she had once seen in her own home, before the world had grown so heavy. The ripples continued outward. In a village far from the trees, a woman received news that her son was safe. The news had traveled through many hands and many voices before it reached her. She sat by her window in the evening and read the short message again and again. It did not say much, only that he was well and that he had seen courage in places she could not imagine. She folded the paper and placed it inside a small box where she kept other precious things. Later, when neighbors came to sit with her, she told them what the message had said. She spoke of the courage her son had witnessed and of how it had given him strength. The neighbors listened quietly. One of them, an older man whose own son was far away, nodded slowly. He thought of the letters he had written and of the small stories he had chosen to include, the way the garden still grew, the way the light fell across the table in the afternoon. Those ordinary details were the same kind of courage his son needed to hear. There were ripples of their own, traveling back across the distance to steady a heart that walked unknown paths. In the forests, the night deepened and the young woman led her group to a place where they could rest safely for a few hours. She and the teenage boy moved among the travelers, offering water and quiet words of encouragement. When one of the travelers, a young woman with tired eyes, asked how they knew the way so well, the guide answered simply. She spoke of afternoons spent walking these paths with her grandmother, learning which trees offered shelter and which trails stayed firm even after rain. The traveler listened and then shared a memory of her own home, of a garden she had tended with her mother before the seasons had turned difficult. The two women sat together for a little while, their voices low in the darkness. The sharing of small memories became another thread in the web of connection that stretched far beyond the trees. The ripples moved outward still. Across the wide water, in a place where the trees grew differently and the fields rolled in gentler waves, a group of people gathered in a small room to listen to news from distant shores. One of them read aloud from a letter that had arrived that week. The letter spoke of ordinary courage in far forests, of hands that steadied strangers, of bread shared without expectation, of paths known by heart and offered freely to those who needed them. The listeners sat in quiet attention. When the reading finished, they remained silent for a long moment. Then one person spoke of a garden she tended in her own yard, of how she still planted seeds even when the weather felt uncertain. Another spoke of a letter he had written to his own son, choosing words of ordinary hope rather than grand promises. These small exchanges in the small room were echoes of the ripples that had begun in distant trees. They were the way courage traveled, not in loud declarations, but in the steady choice to keep tending what could still be tended. Back in the forests, the young woman and the teenage boy rose with the first light and prepared to guide another group. The travelers they had rested with the night before were ready to continue. Before they parted, the older man who had shared bread with the boy pressed a small smooth stone into the boy's hand. He said it had come from a river near his home and that it had traveled with him for many months. The boy accepted it and placed it carefully in his pocket. The stone would become another small memory carried forward, another ripple that would one day reach someone else who needed to know that courage could be held in the hand as well as in the heart. The forests continued to breathe around them. The trees stood patient and tall, their roots deep in soil that remembered everything yet still supported new growth. The young woman moved through the green shadows with the same quiet determination she had always carried. The teenage boy walked beside her, the stone in his pocket a small weight that felt like connection rather than burden. Together they led strangers along paths that only they knew, offering water and steady hands and the simple presence that said no one needed to walk alone. These acts, small and unmeasured, sent their own invisible waves outward. They traveled through letters folded and carried across oceans. They traveled through stories told in low voices in rooms far from the trees. They traveled through the quiet choices of people who heard those stories and decided to tend their own gardens, write their own letters, and offer their own small kindnesses to whoever stood nearby. The ripples crossed the world in this gentle way. They did not arrive with fanfare or demand attention. They settled into hearts that were tired and uncertain, offering the simple reminder that ordinary courage in one place could steady ordinary hearts in another. A flask passed in the darkness of a forest became a story told beside a kitchen table across an ocean. A shy smile offered at the edge of a new village became a memory carried by a soldier who later wrote of it to his mother. A stone from a distant river became a small anchor in the pocket of a boy who guided strangers through the night. These were the ways the courage of ordinary people traveled, not in grand gestures, but in the steady accumulation of small acts that refused to let despair have the final word. The invisible waves of courage that spread from these forests remind us how much quiet dedication goes into preserving truth. If this story has moved you, a small tip on Ko-Fi, even $1, helps sustain the countless hours of research and care that go into bringing these forgotten human moments back to light for everyone who needs them. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The forests remained, and the people who knew their hidden trails continued to move through them with the same patient care. Letters continued to travel, carrying ordinary words across impossible distances. Stories continued to be told in quiet rooms and around low fires, each one adding its own small ripple to the larger pattern. The young woman and the teenage boy walked on through the green shadows, their steps sure and their hearts carrying the memory of every hand they had steadied and every kindness they had received. Far away, across oceans and borders, other hearts carried those same ripples forward, planting seeds in uncertain soil, writing letters that chose hope over fear, offering bread and water and steady presence to whoever stood nearby. The courage that began in the quiet forests did not stay there. It moved outward in gentle waves, touching lives that would never know the names of the trees or the faces of the guides, yet still finding a place to settle and grow. In this way the slow turning of history toward light continued, not through loud victories alone, but through the steady, unmeasured accumulation of ordinary people choosing to remain human with one another, one small act at a time, across every distance the world could place between them. In the quiet hours when the world had grown still again, a man sat with a small photograph held close to his chest, the edges worn smooth from many nights of being carried through darkness and light, the faces within it more real to him than the room around him. He had returned to a village that looked both familiar and changed. The trees still stood where they had always stood, but some branches were missing and new growth had begun to fill the spaces. His house remained, though parts of the roof had been mended with whatever wood could be found. He sat at a table near the window where the late afternoon light fell softly across the wooden surface. The photograph rested in his hands. It showed two young men standing side by side, arms around each other's shoulders, their faces open with the kind of laughter that belongs to those who have not yet learned how heavy the world can become. One of the faces was his own, younger and less marked by the miles he had walked. The other belonged to a friend who had not come home. He traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb, the way he had done on many nights when sleep would not come. The paper was soft now, almost like cloth, from being folded and unfolded and carried in a pocket close to his heart. He remembered the day it had been taken, the way the sun had felt on their faces and the way his friend had made a joke just before the picture was made, so that both of them were laughing when the shutter clicked. That laughter lived inside the photograph now, a small, steady light that no amount of time or distance could dim. He thought of the letters he had written to his friend's family, letters that had been half finished because the words had felt too large for the thin paper. He had sent what he could, small stories of ordinary courage and unexpected mercies, the kind of details that might bring comfort when larger explanations could not. Outside the window, children played in the yard. Their voices rose and fell like the sound of water over stones, light and unhurried. One of them, a girl with dark hair and serious eyes, came to the doorway and stood watching him for a moment. She was his niece, born while he had been away. She had never known the friend in the photograph, yet she seemed to understand that the picture held something important. She stepped closer and sat on the bench beside him without speaking. After a little while he opened the photograph so she could see it. He told her, in a voice kept low and gentle, about the day it had been taken and about the friend who had made everyone laugh even when the days grew long. He did not speak of loss in heavy terms. He spoke of the way his friend had once shared his last piece of bread with a stranger on the road, and of the way he had steadied a tired comrade with a hand on the shoulder when words were not enough. These were the faces he carried forward, the face in the photograph and the face of the kindness that had lived behind it. The girl listened with the quiet attention children sometimes give when they sense that a story matters more than they can yet understand. When he finished, she reached out and touched the edge of the photograph with one small finger, the same way he had done so many times. Then she leaned her head against his arm for a moment before returning to the yard. He watched her go, the photograph still in his hands, and felt something loosen in his chest. The story had been passed, even in its small and incomplete form. It would live now in another heart, carried forward in a different way. In another house not far away, a woman sat with a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters had come from her son over many months. Some were complete and carefully written. Others were half-finished, the last sentences trailing off as if the writer had been called away before he could finish. She read them slowly, one by one, letting the familiar handwriting settle into her like water finding its way into dry ground. The letters spoke of small things, the way the light fell through the trees in the evening, the sound of rain on a tent, the quiet way comrades shared what little they had. They did not speak of grand events. They spoke of the courage that lived in ordinary moments, the kind that could be carried in a pocket or held in the heart when the night grew long. She folded each letter again after reading it and placed it back in the bundle. When she finished, she tied the ribbon with the same careful hands she had used to open it. Then she stood and walked to a small shelf where she kept a photograph of her son and his friends. The photograph was newer than the one the man carried, but the edges were already beginning to soften from being touched so often. She placed the bundle of letters beside it and stood for a moment with her hand resting on both. These were the faces she carried forward, the face of her son and the faces of those who had walked beside him. They were the inheritance she would one day pass to her grandchildren, not in loud stories of battles won or lost, but in the quiet details of bread shared and hands steadied and letters written even when the words came slowly. Outside, the village moved through its evening rhythm. People returned from the fields with tools over their shoulders. Children were called in from their play. Smoke rose from chimneys as simple meals were prepared. In one house a man sat with his photograph and in another a woman sat with her letters, each carrying forward what they could of the faces and the mercies that had shaped them. These small acts of remembering were their own form of everyday heroism. They asked for no recognition. They simply continued, one careful folding of paper, one gentle tracing of an edge, one quiet story told to a listening child. In the years that followed, the photographs and letters traveled into new hands. The girl who had sat beside her uncle grew older and one day found the photograph in a drawer. She took it out and looked at it for a long time, remembering the low voice that had once told her stories of laughter and shared bread. She placed it in a frame and set it on a shelf where her own children could see it. When they asked about the faces, she told them what she remembered, the day the picture was taken, the way one man had made the other laugh, the small kindnesses that had been carried across long roads and passed from one heart to another. The stories grew gentler with each telling, the edges softened by time and by the quiet resilience of those who chose to remember rather than forget. The woman with the bundle of letters passed them to her granddaughter one evening when the light was low. She untied the ribbon and let the girl hold the papers in her small hands. She spoke of the son who had written them, of the way his words had carried the sound of rain and the feel of sunlight through leaves even when he was far from home. She did not speak of what had been lost. She spoke of what had been kept, the courage that lived in ordinary descriptions of ordinary days, the mercy that had been offered in small gestures and carried forward in careful handwriting. The granddaughter listened with the same quiet attention her mother had once given, and when the stories were finished she helped tie the ribbon again. The bundle returned to its place on the shelf, but something of it had already moved into the girl's heart. It would travel with her as she grew, another face carried forward into a world that would need such quiet inheritances. These were the ways the hidden acts of valor continued. They did not remain in the forests or on the roads where they had first been lived. They traveled in photographs with worn edges and letters with half-finished sentences. They traveled in the low voices of those who chose to speak of small mercies rather than large losses. They traveled in the hands of children who touched the edges of old paper and felt, without quite knowing why, that something important was being passed to them. The courage that had lived in the steadying of a tired comrade or the sharing of a last piece of bread found new life in the telling. It became part of the quiet inheritance that shaped the world for those who came after, not through loud monuments or grand declarations, but through the simple, persistent choice to carry the faces forward and to let their stories continue in the gentlest of voices. For those who wish to go deeper into these hidden networks of courage, our Patreon community offers free podcasts, extended raw video segments without blurring, and a warm circle of fellow history lovers who believe, like you, that remembering the personal side of history heals us all. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The years continued their slow turning. Photographs remained on shelves and letters remained in bundles tied with faded ribbons. Children grew into adults who one day found themselves telling the same stories to their own children, their voices low and gentle in the evening light. The faces in the photographs stayed the same, young and open, caught in moments of laughter or quiet companionship, while the hands that held them grew older and the voices that spoke of them grew softer. Yet something essential did not change. The small mercies that had been lived in forests and on long roads and in the quiet spaces between one careful step and the next continued to travel forward. They lived in the way a photograph was kept close to the heart long after the faces within it had gone. They lived in the way a letter was read again and again until the paper grew soft from handling. They lived in the way a story was passed from one generation to the next, not as a burden of loss but as a quiet gift of resilience, the gift of knowing that even in the longest nights, ordinary people had chosen to steady one another, to share what little they had, and to carry the faces of those they loved into whatever light remained. These were the inheritances that shaped the world after the storms had passed. They asked nothing more than to be remembered gently and passed forward with the same quiet care that had first created them. And so they continued, one photograph traced by a careful thumb, one letter folded and unfolded by hands that understood its weight, one story told in a low voice to a listening child who would one day carry it further still. In the soft light that fell through the birch groves years after the guns had grown silent, a man walked once more along the path that led to the river, his steps slow and unhurried, the ache of memory resting gently beside the deep peace that had finally found room to breathe within him. The trees stood tall and white-barked, their leaves moving in the breeze with a sound like quiet pages turning. Sunlight slipped through the branches in pale, shifting patterns that touched the ground and then moved on, as if the forest itself were breathing in its own slow rhythm. He had walked this path many times before, though never with the same lightness in his chest. The years had changed the land in small ways, new growth where old branches had fallen, wildflowers returning to the clearings, the river running clear and steady as it always had. He carried a small photograph in his coat pocket, the edges softened from being held so often. Sometimes he would take it out and look at the faces, letting the memory settle without pulling too hard. Other times he simply walked with the weight of it close to his heart, a quiet companion rather than a burden. He reached the river's edge and stood for a while watching the water move. It reflected the sky and the trees in shifting fragments, never holding any image for long before the current carried it away. He thought of the letters he had once written and received, the ones that had spoken of home in the simplest words, the way light fell through a window, the sound of rain on a roof, the small kindnesses shared between people who had little left to give. Those letters had traveled far and arrived when they were needed most. Some had been read by lantern light in forests far from here. Others had been carried in pockets across long roads and folded again and again until the paper grew soft. He had kept many of them, tied now in a bundle that rested on a shelf in the small house he had returned to. They were part of what he carried forward, along with the photograph and the memories that no paper could fully hold. A little farther along the bank, an older woman sat on a low stone, her hands resting on a walking stick she no longer needed for every step but still carried out of habit. She had known this river all her life. She had walked beside it as a girl, helped tend the fields that ran down to its edge, and later returned to it after years of absence. When she saw the man approaching, she raised a hand in greeting, not with urgency but with the quiet recognition of two people who had both learned to move slowly through the world. He sat beside her on the stone without being asked. For a while they said nothing, letting the sound of the water fill the space between them. Then she spoke in a low voice about the way the birches had grown taller since she was last here, and about the small green shoots she had noticed pushing up through soil that had once seemed too marked to support anything new. He listened and then told her, just as quietly, about the photograph he carried and about the friend whose face still lived clearly in his mind even after so many seasons had passed. She nodded as he spoke, her eyes on the moving water. She understood the weight of carrying faces forward. She had her own photographs and her own bundle of letters, kept in a drawer where she could reach them when the evenings grew long. Some nights she would unfold one and read the familiar handwriting by the light of a single lamp, letting the words wrap around her like a shawl. The letters spoke of resilience in small things, the way a hand had steadied another on a muddy bank, the way bread had been broken and shared without ceremony, the way people had continued to plant and tend even when the ground carried the memory of what had passed over it. These were the stories she chose to remember most clearly. They had helped her find her way back to this river and to the quiet peace that now lived alongside the ache. They sat together for a long time as the light shifted and the shadows of the birches lengthened across the water. A small kindness passed between them without being planned. She offered him a piece of bread she had wrapped in cloth earlier that morning, breaking it and handing him half. He accepted it with the same careful hands he had once used to accept water from a stranger in a forest clearing. They ate slowly, the bread tasting of the day and of the simple act of sharing. When they finished, she stood and brushed the crumbs from her skirt, then offered him her arm as they walked a little farther along the bank. He took it lightly, not because she needed the support but because the gesture itself felt like another small thread in the quiet web that held them both. They spoke of children and grandchildren, of the way the next generation was learning the names of the trees and the feel of the soil between their fingers. These were the faces being carried forward now, the young ones who would grow up knowing the land not only through stories of what had been endured, but through the simple, daily acts of walking it and tending it and breathing under its open sky. As the afternoon deepened, they turned back toward the village. The path wound through the birch grove again, the trees standing like quiet guardians on either side. He thought of the many paths he had walked in his life, the hidden trails through forests at night, the long roads that had carried him away and then brought him home, the small trails between rows of turned earth where seeds had been planted with patient hands. Each path had asked something of him. Each path had also given something back, the steady presence of a comrade, the kindness of a stranger offering bread, the quiet strength that came from knowing the land remembered and still supported new growth. The photograph in his pocket felt lighter now, as if the faces within it were walking beside him rather than weighing him down. The ache of memory remained, but it no longer filled every space. There was room now for the peace that came from knowing the land and its people had come home to themselves. In the village, doors stood open to the evening air. Smoke rose from chimneys as simple meals were prepared. Children played in the yards, their laughter rising like birds startled from the grass. The man returned to his small house and placed the photograph on the table near the window where the last light still touched it. He sat for a while with his hands resting on the wood, listening to the sounds of the village settling into night. He thought of the letters on the shelf and of the woman by the river who carried her own bundle of words and faces. He thought of the young ones who would one day ask questions and of the gentle answers that would be offered in return, not heavy with loss, but steady with the quiet resilience that had allowed so many to keep walking, keep planting, keep breathing under whatever sky they found themselves beneath. Before we close this chapter, I warmly invite you to join our free weekly email newsletter. As a thank you, you will receive the beautiful ebook The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, filled with forgotten tales of courage and hidden heroes that echo the quiet peace we have walked toward together. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The evening deepened into night, and the birch grove stood silent under the first stars. The river continued its slow movement, carrying reflections of sky and trees toward whatever lay downstream. In the small houses, lamps were lit one by one, their light falling across tables where photographs rested and bundles of letters waited to be opened again when the heart needed their familiar weight. The man who had walked the path that day lay down to sleep with the photograph near his hand. He dreamed not of the long roads or the green shadows, but of simple things, the sound of water over stones, the feel of bread broken and shared, the way light moved through leaves when the breeze was gentle. These were the dreams that came when the body and the heart had finally found their way home. Years continued to pass in their quiet turning. The man walked the path to the river many more times, sometimes alone and sometimes with the woman who had shared bread with him on the stone. The children grew taller and began to ask their own questions about the faces in the photographs and the stories carried in the letters. The answers came gently, and voices kept low and steady, the same way stories had always been passed in these villages, through the simple act of remembering without being crushed by the weight of what was remembered. The land continued to breathe under the open sky. The birches grew taller. The river kept its patient rhythm. And the people who had endured walked among them, their hearts carrying both the ache and the peace, their steps unhurried, their presence a quiet declaration that life had insisted on continuing and that the land and its people had, at last, come home to themselves. The open sky received them all without hurry. The trees stood witness. The water moved steadily onward. And in the gentle space between memory and peace, the quiet work of breathing freely went on, one unhurried step, one shared story, one small kindness at a time.